Some words have been changed to abide by YouTube censorship. In 2015, Betty Broderick published a book, Telling on Myself, in an attempt to justify her actions, which led to the unalivings of her ex-husband, Dan Broderick, and his wife of 7 months, Linda Kolkena Broderick, on November 5, 1989. It was 2 days before Betty's 42nd birthday, and 17 days before Dan's 45th birthday. Linda was only 28 years old. There's a summary on the back of the book where Betty made accusations of domestic A-word, gaslighting, and being railroaded in the court system. Betty claimed she struggled through financial hardship for years, maintaining the role of an obedient wife and mother as her husband ignored his family to become a successful lawyer in San Diego, California. As soon as he accomplished this, Betty said Dan left his family for a much younger woman he had been having an affair with for 2 years while they were still married. Betty also claims he harassed her with the help of his new wife. He used his connections as a lawyer to crush her in the court system, and he attempted to drive her insane so Betty would unalive herself and he could erase her from his new life. Betty said the constant pressure he had her under left her with no other choice than to confront both Dan and Linda while they slept in their bed early on a Sunday morning and ended their lives. She said many people exonerate her for this crime, and she wanted to tell her side of the story for the first time in her own words. Betty's book will be compared to other sources to test the validity of her book. Additional reference material will include the true crime book Forsaking All Others, the real Betty Broderick story, released in 1993 by Loretta Schwartz Noble. Another source is Until the Twelfth and Never. It's a true crime book released in 1993 by Bella Stumbo. For this video, there was a republication released in 2013 marking the 20th anniversary, and this version will be the source. A marked difference between the versions is a foreword added to the updated version written by true crime writer Kathleen Houston. There are also 2 made-for-television movies currently found on YouTube called A Woman Scorned, followed by Betty Broderick Part 2, Her Final Fury. The case was followed by court TV, and archived videos are on YouTube. There was a true crime series about the Broderick case called Dirty John, released in 2020. It's season 2 with 8 episodes. Betty and her children were also interviewed separately on Oprah. They can be found on YouTube, along with part of an interview Betty gave from prison. Betty was also depicted on an episode of Snapped, Season 25, Episode 11. Snapped Highlights is on YouTube. Multiple YouTube creators have also covered this true crime. Due to the overwhelming amount of information concerning this case, this will be a 2-part video to research Betty's story. The first part will cover the early lives of Dan and Betty, the wedding on April 12, 1969, the remaining college years as Dan completed his education, their move to California, and the problems in the Broderick marriage that finally led Dan to walk out of their San Diego home on February 28, 1985. Part 2 will cover their separation, the eventual divorce of the Brodericks, Betty's actions that led to the unalivings of Dan and Linda, 2 trial cases the state of California brought against Betty, and any current information about Betty's life in prison, along with her parole hearing. The same woman who wrote the foreword in Stumble's 20th anniversary book also wrote the foreword for Betty's book. Kathleen McKenna Houston appears to take on the writing style similar to James Patterson. As with Loretta Schwartz Noble, dialogue and scenes were recreated in order to portray the emotions and feelings more effectively. The problem with this form of writing is the reconstructed conversations and scenarios of the people involved in these cases are imagined to the point where what happened can read more like fiction than fact. And with these women writers in particular who covered Betty's story, there is a bias to tell the story from a single perspective. As Schwartz Noble wrote, when there are conflicting versions of events, I have chosen to present Betty Broderick's point of view, since this book is an attempt to bring the reader into her world. Therefore, what's written may not be factual and not considered journalistic work. Bella Stumbo appeared to have done some additional research with her work, but also conferred to Betty's version of events for parts of her book. Houston stated in a podcast, A Curious Rose, found on YouTube, that she only writes true crime books concerning very entitled people. She published a book in 2021 called Blood and Marriage, about the unalivings of Shanann Watts when she was 15 weeks pregnant and her 2 young children, Bella and Cece, at the hands of husband and father Chris Watts. This book was completed after attempts to write an earlier book, titled All My Broken Pieces, was eventually abandoned by her after part of the book was leaked online. It was written in the perspective of Chris Watts' mother, Cindy, as she attempted to explain the problems she believed were in her son's marriage, with much of the blame focused on Shanann. Houston also wrote the foreplay for that book in her own voice. She claimed on the same podcast, after researching online about the case, she contacted Cindy Watts to understand how it would feel to be the mother of a family annihilator. Houston wrote her a letter and said they were friends for a while until the unfinished book was deliberately leaked. She gave Cindy a copy of what she had written up to that point and said she had never done that before. During that time, Houston learned Chris had attempted to give Shanann pain medication, so he said she would miscarry. But Houston believed he wanted to end her life. She reported this to police, and she said she ended her relationship with the Watts family. Houston first met Betty Broderick on a visit to Chino Corona Prison in California. She called Chino the who's who of prisons. Houston had been to the prison before to talk to Susan Atkins, one of the members of the Manson family. She was also pen pals with Charles Manson. People who commit these highly publicized crimes enjoy receiving attention. They view it as admiration. Houston makes it clear that she considers herself a victim-focused author, and she said she loved the victims involved in these cases. Houston recalled first reading about Betty in an article she found in People magazine left behind at her doctor's office. On the cover was a photo taken of Betty on her wedding day with Dan Broderick smiling beside her. Houston said she was so interested in reading the article that she wouldn't stop when the receptionist called her name for her appointment. She was a young bride then, and she said she related more to Linda Kolkena Broderick and understood how wrong it was for a young woman to have her life taken away from her. She said she looked at the photos of the once beautiful model who grew older and unhappier throughout her marriage and believed Betty was a witch and a psycho. Houston watched the made-for-TV movies and read all she could about the case. It seemed the country was obsessed with Betty Broderick at the time. Houston said, back then we didn't know about the psychological damage of adultery, and referred to the pain it inflicts as being hit like a bucket of battery acid and destroys your brain and your heart. As Houston grew older and returned to Betty's case, she realized she could better understand what Betty must have went through. She wrote, "See, that's the thing about Betty's story. At one time or another, we're all going to go there somehow. We all get dumped at one time or another. We have relationships that don't work out, and we all have to deal with rejection." Houston believed Betty represented all the women who have ever been cheated on and act out due to maddening despair and anger. Much has been said about the Broderick case, but for the first time, Betty was able to tell her own story for the benefit of herself, with any financial proceeds she's said to be split amongst her children. Betty goes back in time to her maternal grandfather, who was an Irish NYPD detective named Michael Cutler. Her maternal grandmother was Mary Alice Cutler. They had two daughters, Betty's mother Marita and her aunt Catherine. They grew up in the Bronx, where they eventually went to school at Hunter College to become school teachers just like their mother. Betty's father, Frank Biscaglia, was also born in New York to Italian immigrants, and he learned to speak both Italian at home and English when he went to school. Betty said he was the youngest of 6, and his family owned their own plastering business. Bella Stumbo wrote on page 47, her father, Frank Biscaglia, the youngest of 13 children of Italian immigrants, was a partner with his brothers in a second-generation family plastering business, and they chatted among themselves in Italian. His family lived in Westchester County, where there were open fields and lots of land. He was the exact opposite of the city girl his future wife would turn out to be. He was not able to complete his college education due to the war, and when he returned home after service, he found a completely different country from the one he grew up in. The war set off an economic boom, and many people found unparalleled prosperity where there once was so much poverty in the country. Betty's parents met in college and married before her father left to fight in the war. The American Historical Association explains why soldiers were willing to marry quickly in an article originally published on November 1st, 1944, titled Why War Marriages. The Union served as a device to ward off the competition of rivals while he was away. It helps to stabilize a young man's life and gave him something to look forward to, a reason to hope. Marriage is also a way to escape loneliness. As for Betty's mother, burying a soldier is patriotic. She became a source of inspiration for her husband. A wife may also collect allotments, an insurance payout, and a steady income for herself and any children the couple have if the soldier does not return home. If he does return, then she has a husband who will work and provide for her family. So even an unwise marriage can be seen as financially beneficial for a woman. Betty claims there was unhappiness in her parents' marriage from the beginning, and it stemmed predominantly from her mother. Marita lived with her parents and sister in an apartment building in New York called Hope Place in the Bronx. After she married, she continued to live with her parents, where she gave birth to Betty's oldest sister, Marita Jane. It was common to name the oldest children after their parents. When Betty's father returned home, the young couple rented an apartment across the hall from Marita's parents. There, Betty's brother, Frank, was born in 1946, and Betty followed in 1947. On page 19, Broderick said, "My mother was a city girl. She loved everything about it, the shows, the parks, the libraries and museums, and the mass transit system of New York that took her to all the places she wanted to go. Her marriage changed all that." On page 20, Betty wrote, "This meant moving to the brand new suburbs that were being built for the young post-war families, forcing my mom to leave her city." Marita was so reliant on the transit system that she found no reason to have a driver's license. Even after her marriage and the move to the suburbs, she still refused to learn to drive. Betty said on page 21, her mother's stubbornness left her feeling very isolated and bored. She said her mother was one of the first desperate housewives, minus all the affairs. There was nothing in her life except repetitive housework, and she missed the fast-paced city life of her youth. Since Marita couldn't drive, Betty estimated her father did about 70% of the kids' stuff. Betty knew from a young age her mother was deeply unhappy with the life she had chosen, or at least drifted into, by taking on the traditional role of wife and mother. Schwartz Noble stated in her book opening, "We needed no self-esteem, no core of individual identity, no personal strength," explaining what women from her generation were raised to believe. That's where Betty's mother was, trapped in domesticity, on a street in a residential area in Eastchester, where any creative outlets were a long commute away. Betty Friedan argued that the suburbs were burning women alive. This traditional role did not mean Marita was subordinate. Far from it. On page 52, Stumble wrote, "Mother was queen, the center of attention at all times. Mother ruled." Her Aunt Catherine also married and moved to the same Joyce Road Betty's family lived on. She said Catherine's family was smaller, and they weren't as packed in their home. What Betty remembers was every house in the neighborhood was exactly the same, but inside the homes were very different. Betty compares the life of her mother to the life of her Aunt Catherine, and she could see how much happier her aunt was because she was willing to adapt to her new environment and learn to drive. This gave her freedom to get out more, and she was better off for it. Betty's parents would have 2 more children after Betty's birth, a sister Claire and her brother Gerald, and the house was crowded until her father built extensions to accommodate his family. Betty was the middle child, and the way she describes her place in the family is exactly how WebMD describes middle child syndrome. There's a science behind the birth order of children. Psychologist Alfred Adler introduced ideas that birth order affects the development of a child. This order of succession is at least part of the reason why siblings grow up in the same home, but their personalities will be different. Characteristics of a middle child can include being rebellious, being sociable, having a sense of not belonging in the family, and feeling overshadowed to the point of questioning whether their parents really care about them. Betty was part of the baby boomer generation. This boom began in 1946 when a record number of babies, 3.4 million, were born in the United States. About 4 million babies were born each year during the 1950s. In all, by the time the boom finally tapered off in 1964, there were almost 77 million baby boomers. Now, why all the babies? There are several factors that led to this. In the industrialized early 20th century, there was a decline in birth rate as people moved off the farms and into the city to work in factories. Having children meant having free labor to work on the farm. It wasn't as productive to have children cramped in small apartments and paying to meet those needs on poor wages. Children were no longer an asset. They became a liability. After World War II, soldiers returned home and were ready to settle down with their war brides. Marriages spiked during and after the war. According to Khan Academy, 96.4% of women and 94.1% of men were married. Couples had children faster after marrying, and the gap between childbirths decreased. They had veteran benefits, including the GI Bill, with good paying jobs and access to affordable housing, so accommodating a large family was possible. According to the National Library of Medicine, there were medical advancements made during the war, and this improved maternal and child health. Infant and mortality rates continued to fall, and efforts to improve the health of mothers and children were made available through new drugs and subsidized milk and foodstuffs. The welfare of mothers and children was finally researched. Another baby would enter the family in 1957 when Betty was 10 years old. She called her last sibling a caboose baby. Betty said women who have spent most of their lives at home caring for their children until they are school age all of a sudden have no excuse to stay at home all day anymore. So they have another baby rather than entering the workforce at their age. For women who have spent years, even decades or more, at home taking care of children, their prospects at entering the workforce is pretty bleak. It sounds crazy that a woman would rather have a child than get a job, but at least with child care, their husbands will continue to provide for them. With the final baby, this brought the children count to 6. Also in Marita's life, she had housekeepers and gardeners and babysitters, along with a husband who was a taxi service for the children. She wasn't burdened with most of the responsibilities other women have who are full-time mothers and housekeepers without domestic help. Betty said she became responsible for the care of the baby at her young age, and it's a form of child A word we know today as parentification. Betty didn't see it that way. She only knew she was being raised to one day be a wife and mother, and this was practice for her. Psychology today describes parentification as a child being forced to take on the role of a supportive adult within the family. Not only does this include taking care of their young siblings, but refereeing their parents' arguments and being privy to their parents' adult problems like dating and financial woes. Betty not only took on the responsibility of a baby, but she was also involved with arguments between her parents where she often felt sympathy for her father. Betty's Irish mother would not allow her father to speak Italian at home. On page 19, Betty wrote, "To this day I wish I knew how to speak Italian." Betty doesn't explain why, but in 1940, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a declaration of war on Japan, Germany, and Italy. The FBI, backed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt's issuance of Proclamation 2527 on December 8th, continued to arrest and take into custody Italian immigrants who were classified as enemy aliens. Even before the war, there was a large wave of Italian immigrants relocating to America because of political upheaval, and this bred resentment in many already established Americans. Betty said Marita also prevented her father from talking about his memories of the war. It was the way people dealt with pain and trauma. They simply didn't talk about it. It would not be until the Vietnam War that we would understand the trauma of war that lingers with soldiers and the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. It's hard to say how he was able to handle the burden of a family and his turbulent home life with any trauma he may have had following the war. There was frequent fighting in the home, and everyone felt uneasy waiting for her mother to blow up. It may be confusing to understand why Marita would choose to marry a man from Italian ancestry, a first-generation Italian American, when she was so obsessed with status. She didn't necessarily choose him, but simply chose from the options that were given to her. She chose a man who would provide for her and sacrifice to make her happy, or at least try to make her happy. It wasn't so much about love as it was a transactional relationship where each other's needs are met. He really wasn't her choice. He was her best option. Betty said Marita blamed her husband for her unhappiness and often took her frustration out on him and her children. She blamed him for moving her away from the city and for knocking her up so many times with so many children and having them so fast. And she blamed him for breathing. He never could make her happy. Betty began babysitting as a way to make a little money and to get away from her unhappy home life. Betty said she found her niche in childcare, and this pleased her mother. It didn't take long for her to have a little baby service running, and she was great with kids. While Betty was attending school at Immaculate Conception Grammar School, a young couple called looking for a babysitter for their little girls. Initially, a friend of Betty's filled the position, but she decided she didn't like the work and handed the job over to Betty. The couple were the Finks, and their home would also provide not only an income for Betty, but a stable environment to get away from her own troubled home. Mr. Fink was a lawyer, and his wife was pregnant at the time with their third child. Every day Mr. Fink would take the evening train home and pitch in with the care of the children. Betty idealized their life and wanted a home just like theirs. It has to be said that Betty only saw the couple for brief periods of time, and she saw them on their best behavior. She didn't see them with realistic eyes dealing with problems all married couples go through. This limited experience may have set up an unrealistic expectation of a relationship for her, even as she continued to work for the Finks right through college. Babysitting is one thing, But Betty also wrote on page 27 she received papers to work underage as a floor model at Bonwit Tiller and at Shaft's restaurant where her sister worked. Plus, she was running a summer day camp for kids at a local school, all the while getting good grades as a student while holding down 4 jobs. She said by the time she was 16, she was ready for college and not only paid for her advanced education herself, but she also paid for a little MG all on her own. Children can receive work permits to work in fields of modeling and acting, but not for restaurant work. More than likely, Betty exaggerates her accomplishments, and her father spoiled her. Betty has no idea what she actually paid for. She worked here and she worked there, and just decided her money must have paid for everything. Later on, Betty would refer to her modeling job in New York to impress people with her stylish New York background. But she was a floor model in a boutique store, and not like a runway model. There's a big difference. Stumble reported on page 54 that Betty told her modeling was never a serious career consideration because my mother thought it was too tacky. I was supposed to be a school teacher until I got married because that was proper. Betty said on page 26 she grew to the height of 5'11" by the time she was 13. But Stumble wrote on page 51 that Betty is a reflection of Marita Biscaglia in so many respects, from her fixation with social awareness to physical size. Only Betty, among the 3 Biscaglia daughters, grew to her mother's imposing height, 5'10". There's not that much difference, but regardless, Betty doesn't appear to be that tall in photos of her. Near her husband Dan, who was 5'9", Betty appears shorter. On her wedding day, they appeared to be about the same height. During that time, and right up through the 80s, women who were at least 5'7" were allowed to do some lower-end modeling. When they were asked what their height was, they gave it as if they were wearing heels, usually 3-inch, but sometimes 4-inch heels. Betty does not appear to be as tall as she or other people claim. A good guess would be about 5'7". At any rate, she was very pretty with blonde hair from a bottle and blue eyes. Betty said on page 26 that she was the proverbial ugly duckling who turned into a swan for a while. She downplayed her looks and told Schwartz Noble in particular that she wasn't considered the prettiest in the family, but that doesn't sound genuine. By the age of 16, she owned Gucci shoes, Natori silk lingerie, and jewelry from Tiffany's. By the time she entered college, she had accumulated a very expensive wardrobe. Betty's appearance played an important role in finding her future husband. It was her calling card. In her world, men were valued for what they did, and women were valued for how they looked. Women were also expected to remain virgins until they married. The downside of this was Betty said her mother was always accusing her of doing things she never even thought about doing. She said she was a good girl. She didn't smoke. She didn't drink. She didn't take recreational substances. She didn't take any birth control and didn't even date until she went to college. Schwartz Noble said on page 22 that there were strict social rules, too. Marita was extremely strict about whom Betty could date. The sole purpose of dating was to find a man suitable for marriage, and she wouldn't know what that young man would achieve in his life until she was certain of the education he attained or was attaining. Betty's father didn't have a degree, and he provided a good life for his family. But Betty was after something more in her life. She wanted a higher status. She wanted to marry a man who would become a professional in his field. Marita obviously wanted that for her daughter, too, but she often yelled at Betty and didn't believe her even when she told her mother the truth. Betty told Stumbo on page 54 that, and I could go out and have an ice cream with them, the boys, or something, and my mother thought I was a S word for a woman who's morally loose. Her mother actually called her that. She said maybe her mother was trying to protect her, but all it made her do was want to leave home as soon as possible. Although Betty lived in New York, she lived a very sheltered existence. She should have experienced so many changes happening in our country, yet she never made any mention of it in her book. She knew nothing of the civil rights movement. Stumbo wrote on page 56 that Betty's most enduring image of feminists from the 60s was a negative one. They were, in her mind, radical, bra-burning lesbians from People's Park in Berkeley circa 1968. She mentioned nothing about the Red Scare and McCarthyism. She lived through the assassination of a president, JFK, without a single word about it. She didn't even mention Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. Phyllis Stumbo listed off many events during Betty's early life in her book, but Betty herself didn't seem to recall anything in hers. Stumbo also wrote on page 56 that Betty said, "I thought Berkeley was Moscow." She later said, "I thought feminists were crazy people. I thought draft card burners were communists, and I didn't know what that meant, except that it was bad." Betty did not form opinions herself. She was simply told what to believe. Whatever happened in the real world never touched her isolated life. Betty only mentioned the Vietnam War because she knew the fathers in her upscale community were powerful enough to keep their sons from serving. Although Dan was married with a child on the way and a student at the time, Betty said he received a draft notice because his deferment for enlisting since he was a med student ceased to exist when he didn't complete his internship. Stumble said Dan had a stomach disorder, while Betty on page 63 was more specific. He had doctor friends of his write letters to the draft board saying he had bleeding ulcers and was on medication for them, and it worked. She doubted he had the medical condition at all. Betty said on page 32 that life had yet to hand me down any tragedies or real struggles, and I thought if I followed the rules, got good grades, did the right thing, my future would be perfect. This is exactly the way a child would think. It's the fallacy of wishful thinking. Merriam-Webster defines it as the attribution of reality to what one wishes to be true or the tenuous justification of what one wants to believe. Betty told Stumbo on page 55 that the theme of the whole thing, she said later, in a rare moment of self-analysis, is that I tried to be perfect. No one is perfect. Raised Catholic, Betty would be prone to believe in fantasy over what is real, rational, and factual. She lived in a bubble, and when this dream existence fell apart, she had no way of coping with the explosion of reality. She looked back on her early life later with resentment to Stumbo on page 53. "Throughout the school years, I was a goody two-shoes and everybody loved me," she said, her voice laced with self-contempt. Betty decided to attend the Catholic college, Mount St. Vincent, rather than the college her sisters chose to attend, Marymount in Manhattan. Betty said Marymount was just a series of brownstones, while her college of choice was a real campus located on the banks of the Hudson River. It was still close enough so she could keep the job she worked at in high school. Except for a few extra responsibilities as a college student, her life didn't change much. Stemmel said on page 54 she lived at home throughout college, right up until the day she was married, commuting to school in a sporty little green MG. Partly it was cheaper. The Biscaglias were comfortable, but never, as some later accounts had it, rich. Stumble asked her why she didn't move out of her parents' home when she became a college student, and Betty said she had more freedom at home than she would have had on campus under the control of those dreaded nuns. Stumble wrote on page 53 that Betty said instead it was the nuns who scared the hell out of her, starting on the very first day in school. Betty may have been a target for them. She was very beautiful with long platinum blonde hair, and she was the center of attention. The nuns may have seen Betty as vain. The role of a Catholic education is to prepare students for high achievement in the financial world, but also to prepare girls to be traditional, conservative, modest, and gracious in womanhood. Betty learned to wear a mask of a sweet, naive girl in order to stay out of trouble. As she told Stumble on page 54, "I learned very early in life that if you look real cute and you're a goody two-shoes, everybody likes you." As Betty entered college, her parents moved from their middle-class home in Eastchester to the more affluent Bronxville. Her college life also opened her up to new connections from meeting young men from affluent families. She met a girl named Eileen who had a brother attending Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. He invited her to join him for a championship year, where they played against their big rival USC. She happily accepted and was properly chaperoned for the event. Betty said on page 33, "So, as a just in case, I always carried a small purse with $10 cash for a cab and a handkerchief, as well as a silver Tiffany pen. Armed with these items against vice, I was ready for anything, or so I thought." A young man approached the table they were sitting at and asked if anyone had a pen. Betty offered hers, and he wrote Daniel T. Broderick III, M.D., with an A in parentheses. Betty looked at the signature and asked him what the A was for. On page 34, Betty said he answered back that it stood for almost, and then began to tell me that he had applied to both law school and medical school, and he had just been accepted to Cornell Medical School in New York. Betty told him she was from New York, and Dan told her he would look her up when he got there. Betty said she didn't expect to see him because Cornell was in Ithaca, but Dan started sending her telegrams and flowers. She must have thought enough of him to give him her address and phone number, because they also talked on the phone. Betty said her life was so full that she didn't think much of him. Dan wanted to meet with her as soon as he started college at Cornell. She said she sent a friend to meet him who smoked, and this angered Dan because he didn't like smokers. Schwartz Noble reported that Betty was shy and didn't think he would show up, so she didn't go. Eventually, she agreed to pick him up to meet friends at Mount St. Vincent's. She started telling him what to do. He got mad, and that was the beginning of the first of many fights. Dan wanted to meet her at Grand Central Station, but Betty said she refused because she didn't meet boys in street corners at Grand Central Station. They attended the Notre Dame Navy game together, and she dressed up in Mr. Fink's full-length raccoon coat to make an impression on him. Betty said on page 36, "It turns out Dan had told all of his friends, 'See that girl over there? That's the girl I'm going to marry.' Someone else told Betty Dan said that about her. He never told her he said that. It's very sad how much these two didn't communicate with each other from the very beginning. Also, it's all very romantic and fairy tale for a man to see a woman across a crowded room and know this is the woman for him. But in reality, that's not an advisable way to choose a life partner. Dan and Betty did talk and correspond before attending the game together, but as problems in their relationship developed, it appeared they chose each other for the wrong reasons. Betty had a list of requirements for her future husband. He couldn't be too much older. He also couldn't be younger. He had to be smart and ambitious. He had to be able to give her the high-status life her parents shared, if not better. He had to be handsome. He had to be of the same religious faith she had. Betty told Stumble on page 55 that I would never in my life have dreamed of marrying a man who wasn't Catholic, who didn't share my views on divorce. That was the number one requirement. He also had to love her and be willing to do whatever he needed to do to make her happy, just like her father did for her mother. So how did Dan measure up to Betty's expectations? Dan was the oldest of 9 children, born on November 23, 1944, to Dan Broderick II and his wife Yolanda. Yolanda was from Duluth, Minnesota, and like Betty's parents, they married before Dan II left for the war. The pregnant Yolanda returned to live with her parents until after Dan was born. Dan's father returned from the war, and the family moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he was raised. He joined his family's lumber business and sent all the children through Catholic schools just like Betty's parents. Both families were very conservative and traditional. Stumble said on page 47 that gender roles were clearly identified in both households. Women were, first and foremost, wives and childbearers. Men were the bread earners, and nobody in either family had ever been divorced. There were some marked differences between the Biscaglias and the Brodericks. Betty's mother ruled the household, and money was never a consideration. Stumble said on page 50 that they also spent more freely on the trappings of the good life, everything from clothing and table wines to housekeepers, a basic difference in acculturation that would divide Betty and Dan until the end of their story. This was the exact opposite of the Brodericks' household. On page 47, Stumble said, although Dan's family, by all accounts, was somewhat wealthier, it was also stricter, thriftier, less concerned with the social amenities than Betty's. Dan's sister made this clear about her childhood to Stumble on page 47. We weren't raised to take money for granted, to spend frivolously. Dan's father ruled the family and was a very rigid man. On page 48, Stumble said, nor were the Broderick children indulged with summer camps and travel, even to New York City. Instead, their father bought a summer home in Madison, Ohio, on Lake Erie, which became the family's annual vacation retreat. Betty's mother was also obsessed with social graces and the civic participation associated with being a social climber. Dan's family had no involvement in these activities, without admitting it to each other. Dan and Betty had different expectations for their future spouses. On page 30, Betty said, Dan wanted to marry someone like his mother, and I wanted to marry a man like my father, or even better, like Bob Fink. Dan wanted to marry Betty immediately, but Betty refused his proposal until she received her degree. Had she married before finishing college, she most likely would not have finished. On page 39, Betty said, I stuck to that decision, no matter how much or how many times he tried to persuade me to change my mind, and thank God I did, because I still have that time when I belong to myself to remember now. She said she also thought about being a nurse, but her mother was a teacher, and Betty just seemed to follow in her mother's footsteps. Betty said she loved to teach, but how much the profession really meant to her was questionable. Schwartz Noble said on page 26 that underneath she knew her education was really a joke. Betty herself said she and her friends joked they were completing their Mrs. degrees, and next they would get their PhTS diplomas, putting husband through school. For far too many women today, college is too expensive to use it simply as a dating service. Since they weren't going to marry anytime soon, they were not exclusive to each other, and Betty in particular dated other young men. Physically, Dan did not appear to be the type of man she regularly dated. Betty listed off a number of young men she dated on pages 40 to 41. One of the other guys in medical school I dated was Peter, a muscular blonde athlete who took me skiing at his family's lake house. Tony C., another guy I was seeing, was already in his third year at Seton Med School. Frank M. was at Harvard Medical and was studying to be a neurosurgeon, like his dad. Basically, Betty was dating a lot of men in the medical field, but none of them went as crazy over Betty like Dan did. But then I also dated a basketball player from Fairfield and a senior from Villanova because they were nice, tall, big, athletic guys, and that was my type. That was not Dan Broderick. Betty told Stumbo on page 57 that he was skinny with these big glasses. He looked like a nerd, she says, but I liked his wit. I liked him. Betty told Stumbo she thought Dan was cute. Puppy is cute. It doesn't seem Betty desired Dan. Schwartz Noble said he was a geek, and Betty's friends couldn't believe she was marrying him. Betty had to meet Dan's family to get their approval, and of course Dan had to have the approval of Betty's family too. Dan's sister Kathleen told Stumble on page 57 that Dan took his new love home to meet his family, and they were dazzled. She was so worldly, so sophisticated, at least in our minds, a glamorous New York model, Dan's sister Kathleen remembers. She told me she made $17,000 in 1 year, and we hadn't been anywhere. Betty wanted his family to like her, and often bought them expensive gifts from New York. Whether she actually made as much money as she claimed is doubtful. According to amortization.org, $17,000 in 1967 would be $163,000 in today's money with inflation. There's no way she was making that much. According to census.gov, the median household income was $7,700 in 1968. Betty was prone to exaggeration, and of course she wanted to impress Dan and his family. It was an arranged marriage between the Brodericks and the Biscaglias, and Dan and Betty were very much products of their environment. Since they were students and working part-time, this limited their dating time and their ability to really get to know each other. Stumble said on page 64 that Dan drove a cab part-time during medical school in Manhattan and worked after classes in a blood laboratory. Betty made plans to go with Dan and a group of friends to ski one weekend, and her parents had a fit. They disabled her car, and her mom went through her suitcase looking for contraceptives. She wasn't able to go. Of course, Betty had no intention of doing anything she thought was improper, but she and Dan didn't seem to have much in common, and the more time they could have spent together, the more that may have been apparent. Unfortunately, they wouldn't realize that until after the wedding. It may not have made much of a difference because Betty said Dan would do things with her she enjoyed even though he didn't like doing them. Betty did the same thing. On page 38, Betty said they developed a group of medical student friends and they used to hang out with them at Henny's bar. Those medical students were Dan's friends, and Betty never enjoyed meeting up at a bar on weekends and drinking to unwind after a hard week. Stumble said on page 58 that never much of a drinker. She now refers hatefully to Henny's as one of those wino places, a cheap Irish piece of junk. Dan was already showing signs that he was pulling away from the Catholic Church, and although Betty said religion was important to her, she ignored this when she married him. She said Dan did not attend premarital classes given by the Catholic Church, yet she didn't call off the wedding. Dan later wrote to Betty, and Stumbo repeated on page 81, "As far as I'm concerned, the Catholic Church is an utter irrelevancy, a meaningless show perpetuated by a lot of simple-minded, unenlightened weaklings who can't cope with life as it really is and who feel compelled to construct an elaborate network of fantasies to deal with realities that any strong, self-respecting person can handle rationally. I just have no respect for these people." Betty knew Dan was very intelligent and he would be a big success one day. As for Dan, he was impressed with Betty's beauty and what it said about him to have such a tall, beautiful, thin model by his side. In an interview Rhett gave when he was a young man, he said something very insightful. He said his parents married for mutual ambition rather than love for one another. Their marriage was a traditional, meaning transactional, relationship. According to Psychology Today, marriages do take on characteristics of a business deal. However, when the marriage lacks intimacy, love, passion, and commitment, the marriage usually occurs because two people join together for selfish reasons: anxiety, emotional or financial neediness, a woman solely to escape her past, or a man who marries a beautiful woman to inflate his ego. Signs of a transactional marriage include partners who may love each other but are not in love with each other. This allows someone else for your partner to find to be in love with. People in love with each other are 100% into their relationship. They are respectful to each other and are concerned for each other's well-being. A marriage without passion will have two people who rarely touch each other in a romantic, playful, or sensual way. Lovemaking is robotic, and they are disinterested in pleasing one another. They rarely talk to each other. They don't express empathy where they are vulnerable, and they don't solve issues together. They should feel a connection together that they don't feel with anyone else, but they don't. Men will hang out with other men and confide in them instead of their wives. Women will hang out with other women and confide with them instead of their husbands. There's no real commitment. A business will trade up and go to the highest bidder, in the same way a man will trade his long-term wife for a younger one. A woman will trade in her husband for a richer and more successful man, particularly if the husband takes a financial loss. She will often look for a sugar daddy to support herself and her children. Betty completed college by December 1968 and was immediately offered a job teaching at Ann Hutchinson School in Eastchester. She met the superintendent in the education's office, where Betty had planned to fill out an application for a position, and after realizing her family was from the area and seeing how attractive she was, he hired her on the spot. Pretty privilege and having connections easily opened doors for Betty. Although she said she landed a position in one of the highest paid school districts, her salary for the full year of 1969 totaled $6,200. When Betty was on the stand for her trial later on, she claimed she made $7,000, but was corrected by the prosecutor. Betty often exaggerates and rounds up financial numbers in her benefit. Since Betty had completed her education and college was really a way to find a husband, she told Dan she was ready to marry, and he presented her with a beautiful handmade ring from an artist in Greenwich Village, of course. She said her mother was excited because Betty was marrying a doctor, and that impressed everyone. Betty claimed she graduated a semester early because she was paying for college, but by graduating early, Betty was able to marry first among her clique of girlfriends, and they were in awe of her. Stumble said on page 54 that one of Betty's college classmates wrote her in 1966, "You were what I've often wanted to be. You present the image of the model woman, and more so, the perfect wife." Betty appeared to be the ringleader of a clique of young women her age who shared the same background. She continued to be the center of attention for a group of women she would surround herself with as she grew older. She may be the school diva or school princess. It's a female who is beautiful, charismatic, manipulative, popular, and wealthy with a high social status. She will have an inflated ego, be selfish and manipulative, shallow and confident, a bully, spoiled, envied by her peers, tall, fashionable, pretty, popular, and privileged. That does sound like Betty. Her supporters may say that Betty was nice and friendly to people and was not a bully. Women can be more underhanded with their actions, more covert in the way they operate. She would be involved with excluding those people who she felt to be inferior to her status. She would gossip about other people. There would be an undermining of others' achievements, emotional manipulation, and exhibit passive-aggressive behavior. It's important to keep these in mind as her marriage fell apart. They were married on April 12, 1969. Betty's wedding had to be a celebration everyone would remember. Betty on page 45 claimed, "I was really busy preparing lesson plans and learning how to be a full-time teacher, so I wasn't all that into wedding planning, and I wasn't in a hurry to start, but my mother was." That's a lie. Betty had been planning her eventual wedding day in her head for years. It was her day to shine. Schwartz Noble said on page 27 that Betty had waited all of her life for this day. So had her mother. Betty and her mom fought over wedding arrangements. Betty said she wanted a small candlelit ceremony at St. Ignatius, where her parents married, and taken afterwards by horse-drawn carriage to the Oak Room for champagne and dancing. Stumble said Betty's wedding ended up being a lavish, traditional affair that was something out of Marita's generation. This was followed by a full sit-down meal at her mother's beach club. This obviously was not what Betty wanted. Stumble said on page 51, Betty's attitude toward her mother is a classic love-hate relationship between mothers and daughters, the age-old tug-of-war between two women so much alike that they are in constant competition and therefore loathe each other. Betty looked like a bride out of the 50s rather than a woman from 1969. Even their song, The 12th and Never, was a song from the 50s. Betty chose her Balenciaga gown and rejected the white-on-white empire waist dresses Marita favored. Betty said with her height, she would have looked like a transvestite or something out of the movie Whatever Happened to Mary Jane. She also chose her bridesmaids' dresses and the 1928 Rolls-Royce to chauffeur them from the church to the club. Schwartz Noble on page 27 said, in the end, they did it Dan's way and had a white Rolls-Royce. The Rolls was not Dan's idea, and it was Betty's, and it was a white. Dan refused to wear the cutaway morning coat and accessories the other men were wearing. Instead, he wore a pinstripe double-breasted suit with a blue and pink flower tie he found for 99 cents and brown wing-tipped shoes. He said he didn't want to wear rented clothes. He may have done it just to anger his overbearing mother-in-law, whom he didn't care for. After he did that, Marita didn't like him either. Betty said Dan and her mother were fighting, and she was in the middle. They certainly didn't like each other, but the fighting was between Betty and Marita. If anyone was in the middle, then it was probably her father who was paying for everything. Betty claimed she paid for the things she wanted in her wedding, but that's doubtful. More than likely, it was on her parents' dime all the way. Dan told Betty they could elope to Pennsylvania and be done with it, but there was no way Betty was going to miss that special day. Betty said on page 48 that she sobbed throughout the entire ceremony and never heard a word the priest or Dan said. She did remember they said in their vows they would stay married for at least 50 years. She repeated that later to journalists covering her story. They were so young when they married, with very little life experience. It's doubtful they truly understood the importance of the vows they repeated to each other, or what it takes to make a marriage work for a lifetime. The newlyweds lost their gift money on the way to the airport, where they went to a private estate on St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. Betty said on page 51, the honeymoon was a disaster. These two virgins in the Virgin Islands had completely different expectations for their honeymoon. Betty proclaimed she was R-worded by Dan to Stumbo, but Stumbo said Betty said that out of bitterness years later. By 2015, Betty had a better recollection of what happened. She said he was drinking. He threw her on the bed, and he did it after falling to sleep on her. It wasn't the romantic interlude she thought it would be. The Catholic Church kept young people in a state or cult of innocence or ignorance. They had no education about their bodies or what to expect. Betty said when she started her period at age 14, her mother threw a box of Kotex at her and told her to use them. Dan was on his way to completing a doctorate, but even he had no understanding of what intimacy would be like between two people. Had they been given some education about this, it may have helped them to alleviate them from the fantasies they thought would happen, but they did not. Regardless, Betty and Dan did not appear to have any sensual chemistry. It's that chemical reaction. In the Schwartz Noble book, Betty said it seemed foolish to admit, but she said it was like a lightning bolt when she first met him. That's a lie, and she said so in her book. Women like Betty cannot afford to rely on romantic feelings for her choice of a husband. She was all head and no heart. That spark between two people will initiate an attraction followed by emotional and intellectual connections that will help maintain a longer connection. It's part of the love language two people share. Women like Betty are not sensual women. Although she had some traits of a traditional wife with having children and being a homemaker, she was always a social butterfly and remained dominant in the relationship for years. Dan did try to make her happy for a time, but the one who was bending over backwards to make the other one happy will eventually break. Betty may have been better off marrying an older, wealthy man, where she could have taken on the role of a trophy wife. She wouldn't have had to go through those early years of growing up, and she would have had a man to pat her on the head and tell her what a good girl she was. But men like that are hard to land. They have plenty of attractive women to choose from, and certainly wouldn't be going out of his way to make Betty happy. She told Stumbo on page 62, from day one, The minute I married him, everything changed. He wasn't courting me anymore. It was more than just the marriage that changed them. It was having children. The children became the main focus, and all of a sudden Betty felt she was pushed to the back burner. Dan may have believed with marriage and children, that meant the end of acting like teenagers in love, and it was time to get on with being adults, just like their parents, or his parents. The game was over, and he wasn't pretending to chase her anymore. Betty couldn't understand why he did so much for her when they were dating, then changed completely after marriage and children. Dan had to grow up fast, while Betty did not. Sorry, that's my dog. He ended up being very disappointed, and Betty didn't seem to understand why he was so upset. Broderick said on page 52 that he went into town without me one day. Then, when I wanted him to come into town with me, he refused, so I went alone. Dan called his brother and told him he had made the biggest mistake of his life. He just married his mother-in-law. But what could he do? He was raised Catholic, and marriage is forever. Betty said he dismissed the help and spent his time reading. He may have wanted to spend some time alone to bond with his wife, but that was never going to happen. Betty and Dan were not compatible, and Dan realized this early on. The honeymoon is a bad time to figure that out. Dan also told people years later that he knew there was something wrong with Betty. What Dan may have realized about Betty early on, she doesn't seem to have any emotional maturity. She blew up whenever she was confronted, but when she didn't get away. She couldn't handle stress in any way. She refused to adapt under different circumstances. She didn't take responsibility for her actions or how she affected other people. She also has a false and inflated sense of herself. Schwartz Noble said after the honeymoon, they moved into Dan's dorm room until a married residence was available that summer. In Betty's book on page 54, she said the residence wasn't ready until September. It's unusual for students to move non-students into student dorms. She would have to receive special permission. Betty had a longer commute to work, and she had to share a bathroom with other students. She said her life went downhill, while Dan's life didn't change at all. She repeated that in her book and in other interviews. Betty never understood the stress Dan was under to provide for his family. Dan never understood the stress Betty was under to care for the children and their home. Betty said she turned her paychecks over to Dan, and it was what he demanded she should do. She doesn't admit to the fact that she had been handing her paychecks over to her father since she had been working, and he took care of her bills. She told Schwartz Noble on page 92, "I have no idea about money. You know I don't do money." Women, particularly women from wealthy backgrounds, did not deal with money. There always had to be a man who dealt with finances. Betty said on page 14 with some pride, "I didn't have to worry about paying the rent, taxes, insurance, and whatever else." This is at least part of the reason why women were passed from father to husband. Betty said when her father walked her down the aisle, he leaned over to kiss her as he handed her off to Dan and whispered, "Good riddance." Betty didn't say how she took that. He might have said it to try to make her laugh because she was crying all day. Then again, he may have been grateful for having one less burden. Let her husband take care of her from now on. It was expected that she would marry well. Schwartz Noble said on page 26, everything about the way Betty was raised taught her that someday she would become part of someone else. In exchange for this fusion of identity, she would be supported, nurtured, and loved. Essentially, she was expected to be taken care of just like a child. Betty would never learn financial responsibility, and that is a core value for maturity. Betty considered herself a high-value woman, which also translates to being a high-maintenance one. Collins Dictionary says it's an informal phrase for someone requiring a high level of care and attention, demanding. She always wants to be the center of attention, and Betty was proud to be such a high-value woman that a man would want to take care of her financially in order to have her. Dan was focused on his education and career, and he placed those over his marriage and even his children so he could be a success. He really wasn't ready for a commitment, and they should have waited until Dan had completed his education and was settled in his career before they married. By then, Dan would be, as Betty said in her book on page 179, fairly untouchable in terms of looks, money, power, and the respect and control that I think he had thought was his due from birth. He could have his choice of women by then, so Betty had to get him when he was young, and had to remain in control of him to maintain her lifestyle she believed was her due. When we look back on the 60s and 70s, we can see how this couple lived through so much social change, but not for Betty and Dan. As Stumble said on page 56, it might not have been the 60s at all, looking at these two. There was no generational gap. Betty and Dan were a reproduction of their parents. They didn't experience the 60s or 70s. They had 350s and moved right into the 80s. Stumble said on page 65, Dan and Betty Broderick were sacrificing for their own good, period. They were completely removed from their own turbulent generation. Stumble found both Dan and Betty to be rather greedy and money-obsessed. To have such high expectations when they also had the responsibility of children was unrealistic. People cannot have it all at once. Betty said she and Dan were returning from dinner at O. Henry's Steakhouse in the village not long after the honeymoon, and by the time she was home, she had heartburn. She never had heartburn before. Dan told her she was pregnant. In her book, Betty said she didn't want a baby because she didn't like being married to him. She blamed him because he was a doctor, and she said he wouldn't let her use birth control. It's hard to understand why Betty could not take the initiative on her own with her medical care and get a prescription for birth control pills if she wanted to hold off on having children. She was Catholic, and the church did forbade the use of using birth control. But Betty would later break Catholic rules with decisions that affected her health and marriage. Stumble on page 60 said, it was also an occasion for Betty Broderick's first gynecological exam because it's what you were supposed to do when you were getting married. What she discovered, she says, was that she had a remarkably confused body, 2 cervixes, 2 vaginas, 2 uteruses. Schwartz Noble said in her book on page 30, Betty found out about her medical condition in a different way. Betty went to the doctor for a D&C. That's when she found out about 2 uteruses and she wouldn't carry children. A D&C is a procedure performed by health professionals for reasons like heavy bleeding or to remove tissue after a miscarriage or fetus termination. Betty had to deal with all these health issues later on in her marriage. Stumble said on page 61, all Betty remembers clearly, she says, is that the doctors told her she was at high risk of becoming pregnant even if she used female contraceptives, but that I would probably never be able to carry a child through to full term. Also, being a good Catholic, she was expected to have a baby, or at least pregnant, by the time of the 1-year anniversary. Catholics had big families, and they both expected to have a lot of children. How would Betty have felt if she was not able to have children when her whole life she was told her role was to be a wife and mother? In her book, she sounded happy to never be a mother. Betty said on page 59, at the time that seemed like good news. Whew, relief. That contradicts statements she made to others. Stumble said on page 68, Betty would always be in conflict with herself over her immediate, inescapable motherhood. She didn't seem to make the connection between the unhappiness her mother felt in her domestic life and the unhappiness Betty would feel in hers. In an interview with Oprah, Betty said she and Dan had very strict gender lines in their marriage. I was home and hearth and children and supported my husband emotionally through good times and bad. And you love that? Oprah asked. I love that, Betty said. It's all I ever wanted to do. She later confirmed the same thing in her book on page 79. All I ever wanted to be was a good mom to a brood of chicks. Betty would later have a falling out with her children, and this may have led to her changing her story. Betty didn't tell Dan about her medical condition. She would have said something about it in her book if she had. It would have affected him because he did want to have a family. And what would have happened to them if Betty was not able to carry a fetus to term? According to Christianity Stack Exchange, infertility is not grounds for an annulment for Catholics unless the infertile person concealed that fact prior to the marriage taking place. Betty did that. She would also go on to have fetus terminations without letting Dan know. Considering Dan was unhappy in the marriage, he could have used that as an excuse to seek an annulment. Betty was taking a big chance, but it worked in her favor. She was on her way to becoming a good Catholic. Daughter Kim was born in January 1970. Betty said she was hosting a party for Dan's med students, and Dan finally walked in late and drunk with a lawyer friend. Betty told him she thought she was in labor, but Dan was too drunk to take her to the hospital, but she took him with her. Labor was quick, and the baby was born before she could get her clothes off. Stumble said something different on page 64. Altogether, she was pregnant 9 times in 10 years. All her deliveries would be by cesarean section, preceded by terrible nausea and discomfort. She said Dan and the doctor went out for a drink, and Betty would be pregnant again before the year was out. Betty claimed throughout her book that Dan was an alcoholic. It may be true. Dan did drink alcohol the entire time they dated, and continued to after they married. Betty said she didn't date drunken boys because they scared her. But with Dan, she didn't seem to mind. Betty said he was arrested one night for drunk driving when the children were young, and she had to pick him up in downtown San Diego. Years later, she said one of the Fink's children were visiting them, and the same thing happened again. She said he was involved in a hit and run, but she didn't say what happened to him legally. Of course, it's very dangerous to get behind the wheel when he was drinking, and he could have hurt someone or himself. On at least one occasion, Dan told her when he was late returning home that he had been drinking and just left it off in his car on the side of a road, which is much better than trying to get home. It's possible that Dan believed he needed alcohol to escape his problems and as a way to loosen up around people. His friends admitted he was not an open or affectionate person. Stumbo said on page 73, his friend Brian Monahan said Dan was not an emotional guy. If you hugged him, he'd stiffen. Betty said he was a hard worker, and everyone who knew him agreed with her. Monahan also told Stumbo on page 71 that Dan was the kind of guy who made all the rest of us look like loafers. The last year at the firm, he billed something like 2,500 hours, when 1,800 is considered tops. They also denied Dan had an alcohol problem. Stumble said on page 71, as for his drinking, Dan Broderick was always a moderate social drinker, friends say. Betty never said if his doctor brought up any concerns with his alcohol use, or if drinking was affecting his health. He may have been using alcohol as a way to deal with anxiety or depression. Stumble said on page 73, but for all of his cold daytime veneer, by night, Dan became one of the boys. He loved hanging out in the pubs, talking law, shooting the breeze. Betty said his father drank, and addiction is an inherited disease. It was possible he had a problem. If she was concerned about his drinking, then she had a strange way of showing it. Betty said on page 91, he liked pina coladas, and I put lots of liquor in them to mellow him out at night. She enabled his drinking. Betty made a grand gesture of attending Al-Anon meetings after Dan left her because she said she was married to a drunk and their problems in the marriage were because of his drinking. But she stopped going when she realized she may have been part of the problem and she had her own issues to deal with. Betty often called Dan a drunk. That's exactly the way she referred to him. Al-Anon have group family meetings for people so they can learn more about the disease, like the difference between alcohol, a word, and dependence. Betty had her own issues, but she would never learn anything from any form of counseling. She always saw herself as perfect, and Dan was the one with the problems. Although Betty herself rarely drank, she did admit to getting drunk at least once, so she claimed, to understand Dan's problems. At any rate, Dan did not let his drinking interfere with his goals in life. In summer of 1970, Dan had just graduated from medical school. The couple returned to his parents' home in Pittsburgh for the summer, and he started law school that fall. Dan would not complete his medical internship after graduating from medical school, nor did he do his residency. Betty said Dan just surprised her out of the blue with his decision to go to law school, rather than continue to be a doctor and go into residency. Betty said on page 63 that his mind was made up. This is what we were going to do. Betty said his years of medical school were wasted by transferring to law school, but by all accounts, his degrees in both fields were an asset. Dan had always taken some law classes on the side, along with an elective at a law firm, and Betty didn't know about that. Mr. Fink, who was a lawyer, and she said in her book she wanted to marry someone like him. Betty told Stumbo on page 65, but Dan told me we could be richer faster if he was a malpractice attorney. I thought it was a great idea. I didn't object at all. I'd vote for being richer any day, wouldn't you? Dan told her he could make $1 million a year, and she was all for it. Schwartz Noble said on page 32, Betty nodded. I know, your dreams are grandiose. All I want is a microwave oven. BS. That is a lie. Only later did Betty change her story when she had to deal with Dan herself in the courtroom, and she turned against all lawyers during her divorce. There was going to be additional college time regardless of his path in life. Betty wanted to marry a 1% earner. One of her minions could be satisfied with a 10% earner. It was about where Dan had more drive and focus. Monahan told Stumble on page 74 Dan loved the law. He told me that he became a lawyer because he decided that being a doctor was too much like being a mechanic, no creativity. On page 65, Stumble said his parents, frugal in the first place, believed it was their responsibility to educate their offspring through one college degree, but they refused to subsidize a second education. Student loans were necessary to finish his education. Before 1965, when the federal government guaranteed student loans provided by banks and nonprofit lenders, students could receive loans from colleges and pay the colleges back for their education. The problem with that is young white Christian upper class males like Dan were the ones who were predominantly chosen by colleges, and this left out minorities. And this was very true for Ivy League universities where students were guaranteed to excel in life. Betty told Stumbo on page 66, Dan always told me image was everything, and I agreed. Harvard is the kind of place where you make contacts for a lifetime. Dan was very brilliant, but making connections to get ahead in life is necessary in this white male-dominated world. Schwarzenegger said on page 32, he could have gone to law school at night or part-time while earning money. No, he couldn't. Dan applied to different universities, but there was no question when he was accepted at Harvard that that's where he would attend. Another college he was accepted at was at the University of Virginia, but no one would accept that college over Harvard. That's where he needed to be to achieve what he wanted to achieve, and Harvard did not have night classes. On page 64, Stumbo said, the young couple, then parents and one child, with a second one on the way, lived for a few months with his parents. During the time she stayed with their in-laws, she said she was very uncomfortable living with strangers with no money and a baby to feed. Betty made it sound like she didn't have food, and the baby went without her needs being met. This was not true. Betty never went without her needs being provided for herself or her children. She was never hungry, never without a place to live, never without clothes to wear, or without medical care. She did not get everything she wanted as she did when she was young and lived with her parents. But that is an adaptation we all make from being a child to an adult. That's part of growing up. Also, Dan's family did not spend lavishly on food and wine as their family did. Betty always thought she had to have the best, and that wasn't the case in her in-laws' home. Betty made accusations against Dan's father. She called him a domestic A-worder and a raging alcoholic. Although he was remembered as being very strict and emotionally unavailable, there's nothing to say he was an A-worder. Stumbo wrote on page 48, among his various household rules, for example, dinner was to be served precisely at the same time each night, and once he sat down at the head of the table, you did not get up, not until dinner was finished, not even to answer the telephone, said Dan's youngest sister, Christy. Their mother, Yolanda, who had left college early to marry, was by all accounts an exceedingly passive partner. It was not a household, in short, into which a pampered, pretty blonde princess from New York was apt to find herself instantly at home. Betty told this lie for a purpose. She wanted people to believe Dan was an A-worder, and for many men, they have learned to treat their spouses that way from watching their father A-word their mother. Betty said Dan physically assaulted her. That's not true. Stumble said on page 90, neither of the Brodericks apparently ever deliberately hit each other. Betty had an explosive temper, while Dan was slower to anger, but he could get just as angry as she was. These two fought all the time. In the midst of an argument, Betty might throw something at him. For instance, a ketchup bottle once. Dan, by contrast, was more inclined to take his temper out on inanimate objects, according to his daughters. Betty attacked people, and Dan attacked objects. Stumble said on page 130, when he left her for good, he said Betty flung a jar of Dep hair gel at his departing back. Although she denies it, he said she also brandished a butcher knife at him. In an interview, to contradict herself, Betty said there was emotional and psychological A-word in the marriage, but left out the physical. Schwarzenegger said on page 41 that Betty had a black eye, but didn't say how she got it. Betty's lawyer also brought up this black eye Betty supposedly had. Someone reported Betty said it was an accident, but made sure her lawyer acknowledged it in court. In Betty's book, she talked about the black eye, too, but she wasn't the one who had it. She said she was the one who gave Dan the black eye. Early in their marriage, Betty was returning home from teaching, and she was tired, and she didn't want to be messed with. Dan sounded like he was goofing off by grabbing her from behind, and Betty said they fell over, and the back of her head hit his cheek. Dan ended up with a black eye, and he went to college telling all of his student friends what his wife had done. He made a joke out of it. Stumble said on page 90, nor did the children ever witness physical violence between the parents. Physical battery was never a viable aspect of the Broderick case. On page 175, Stumble said when Betty later drove her vehicle into his front door, that was the most angry Dan had ever acted toward her. He reached in, jerked her out of the van, and slammed her in the chest with his fist, knocking her to the ground. According to Betty, that was the only time Dan ever deliberately hit her. Schwarzenegger on page 36 said Betty told her a few times he smashed me. Dan never hit Betty. Truthfully, if there was a batterer in the home, it was most likely Betty. Kim later testified on the stand about Betty digging her claws into Dan's arm when she was angry and she threw things at him. Kim said Betty was bigger than Dan, and she was never afraid of him. Betty also insinuated that Dan was an animal A-worder. Betty bought these two little dogs, supposedly for the boys to play with, and each dog cost $500 each. About $2,000 in today's money. Dan didn't care much for the dogs, and they ran under his feet, and he would kick them out of the way, but he didn't intentionally injure them or show any malice towards them. There's my dog. He just didn't care for them. His sister talked about a time when Dan was a teenager and a pet horse of his died. He was so bereaved by the loss of the animal that he spent his days in his room crying. Also, during a fight with Betty, he threw a fish tank over the balcony of the home, and there are some who point to that as a sign of an animal A-worder. But there is no proof that Dan deliberately hurt an animal out of malice or took pleasure in the suffering of an animal. As for Betty, she claimed a house she rented years later was infested with rats, and her ideas of extermination were downright inhumane. She and the children trapped one of the rats in the oven and cooked him alive. What Betty didn't understand that Dan may have realized because of the differences in their upbringing is raising the children in a home where there is arguing and fighting between the parents is a form of child A-word, even if it's not directed at the children. There are YouTube creators who put up a short video as a demonstration of how quickly this will affect children. According to Parents.com, parents' fights affect their children's mental health, including increasing the risk of depression and anxiety, lowering self-esteem, and impairing their sense of security. Long-term problems include decreased cognitive performance, fighting among siblings, trouble maintaining healthy relationships as adults, eating disorders, physical issues like sleep problems and headaches, increased aggression, delinquency, behavior problems, substance use, and a negative outlook on life. Destructive disagreement tactics include name-calling, insults, threats of abandonment like divorce, throwing things, walking out, or withdrawing from an argument, and capitulating or giving in to the other parent. What's important is the message parents are sending their children about their relationship. Above everything else, parents should teach children to treat each other with respect. When parents do fight and children are involved, and they're always involved, they should discuss the argument at a family meeting. The children should be reassured that they still love each other and they're not going to divorce, assuming that they're not. Help children understand that arguments happen sometimes and people lose their tempers, but the families still love each other and remain strong. The Broderick children were raised with constant fighting and mimicked this behavior growing up. Brett was the youngest, and he never knew a time when his parents weren't fighting. Then the children joined in the fighting, and what's abnormal becomes normal. Betty not only threatened divorce to Dan, but she told the children they were divorcing and they would have to choose who to live with. Then Dan would return home and tell them they weren't getting a divorce, but hearing the constant threats from Betty assisted in wearing the marriage down. Betty also claimed repeatedly that the couple were poor. Betty doesn't know what poor is. She had to look up the word in the dictionary to know how to spell it. She said Dan moved them from Pittsburgh to Cambridge to start law school, where they lived in a bootleg apartment. Betty found out she was pregnant with Lee, and they moved to Cambridge. Dan took out a student loan to pay for a place to live, and Betty was very unhappy with it. She claimed they lived in a basement bootleg apartment with no windows, no heat, and no water. Another source doesn't quite paint as bad a picture of the place. Schwartz Noble said on page 33, most of the winter the heat and hot water didn't work. Betty said she was never so miserable or cold in her life. Since Dan was a new student at Harvard, they had to start at the very bottom. They eventually moved to other apartments, and although they didn't have much money, their living situation did improve. Would it have hurt Betty to have a little bit of gratitude for an apartment she didn't have to work to pay for? Betty told Stumbo on page 66 they had few friends in those days, she said, because neither of them wanted anybody to see the poor conditions in which they lived. Betty admitted on the stand years later that she and Dan did have friends visit them, and Dan watched the children when Betty and a friend spent the day shopping together. Of course, it was a struggle. That's part of growing up, and Betty exaggerated how bad it really was. Betty claimed Kim had a dresser drawer for a crib and insinuated they were so poor that's all they could afford. It's hard to explain to people now who have gender reveal parties and baby showers before the second trimester of a pregnancy, but generations ago, people didn't prepare early when women had their first pregnancy. Dan and Betty were raised to follow their parents, and for them a pregnancy had a high risk of ending in a miscarriage. It was common for a couple to wait to make sure the baby was alive and healthy before they received anything for the first baby. Stumble said on page 77 that Dan and Betty Broderick were probably no different, at least not in those early days, from most other young couples caught in the pressures of premature parenthood and blindly trying to live out pre-assigned gender roles passed on from an earlier generation. Stumble said on page 64, Betty spent her savings. Her parents kicked in for baby clothes and other necessities. Of course, the grandparents sent over some things. Schwartz Noble said on 31, Marita had a few essentials delivered from Saks, and her friends planned an emergency baby shower. Neither Betty nor the children went without anything. Betty is just spoiled. Betty also was teaching and didn't let the school know how far along she was in her pregnancy so she could keep working. Although Betty always claimed she worked right up to the day of delivering her children, she apparently finished out the school year and gave birth in January, which plenty of other pregnant women are capable of doing. Stumble said on 65 during those years, she also continued to work at assorted odd jobs to help keep them afloat. Betty, and Schwartz Noble in particular, resented the fact that Betty worked at all to help meet the financial needs of the family. Betty only worked part-time odd jobs here and there for brief periods of time. Dan said later on the stand for the separation of their assets, at one job she made all of $187. Every penny helps when two people are young and they're struggling to make it, but Betty was able to spend nearly all of her time at home with her children and worked outside the home at her leisure. The majority of women don't have that luxury. Schwartz Noble said on 33, they were so poor that they couldn't have made it without the government surplus food. She didn't seem to understand what assistance was. After all, Schwartz Noble married doctors. Betty claimed she was the breadwinner of the household. Broderick said on page 61, someone has to make money for us to eat. As Betty said on the stand many years later, their income fell under the poverty line, and they qualified for food stamps, now called SNAP benefits. Stumble repeated this on 65. At one time, they even supplemented their income with food stamps. Thanks to food stamps and the student loan, Betty could spend most of her time at home caring for her children. Betty also doesn't discuss how the couple paid for their medical care for herself and the children. Neither do Schwartz Noble nor Stumble. There would be doctor visits and hospital bills. It's possible Betty and her children also received medical assistance through the state, at least with two of her pregnancies. Stumble said on page 64, thieves stole their car, her MG, and his grandparents gave him a new one, a Volkswagen Bug. Betty said Dan's grandparents gave them the money to buy an orange Volkswagen hatchback. The MG Betty had was stolen one night, and Dad did not have the insurance to cover it. On page 62, Broderick said, lo and behold, the financial genius and the head of our household's banking institution, who had insisted that he alone manage our money, had canceled our insurance without telling me. Betty said Dan turned in the insurance money to buy clothes, but by then the insurance Betty's father paid on the car to get the couple started in their new life together would have expired, and Dan, trying to save money, probably just had liability on the car. After all, Betty said on page 90, money and the handling of it was men's work. His grandparents offered the money as a way of saving the marriage, because no doubt Betty went off on him when she realized what Dan had done. As she often told him, that was her car. He bought a little motorcycle for himself to get back and forth to college on. By the end of the year, they had the money to buy another vehicle. Betty said she had to ride the bus to the laundromat to wash clothes since they didn't have a vehicle, and no doubt it was hard, but it was only for a few months, at best, and not the years she claimed. And Dan learned a valuable lesson about having insurance that would help them later on in life. Betty also accused Dan of hitting Kim when she was 10 months old. This would have been around November 1970, just after the car was stolen and before they bought the new car from Dan's grandparents. She claimed she came home one evening from the laundromat. She said Dan was hitting her with both of his hands. In her book, Betty said she screamed at him and she wanted a divorce, and Dan tried to stop her. She brought Kim with her by a Greyhound bus to her parents' home. Betty said her parents didn't care. They let her and their grandchild spend the night, and her father brought them back the very next day to the bus station to return to Dan. Her mother told her that she wasn't raising her children, and she was married, and to just live with it. Dan never apologized, but never hit Kim or any of the children again. To Schwartz Noble in 1993, on pages 34 to 35, Betty said something different. I went to New York, but when I got to New York, I couldn't tell my parents why I had come. I just pretended I went to have a visit. She also stayed longer than just an overnight trip. A few days later, she came back. Where would she go with a baby on one hip and another on the way? She'd agreed Dan never A-worded anyone again. He never hit her after that. After all, the children would remember and tell Aunt Betty if she said something they knew wasn't true. It wasn't possible for Kim to remember what happened at 10 months old. Years later, Dan remembered a time when Betty left after they had been married for a year, and she told him that she wanted a divorce. They had an argument, and she was threatening to leave him. She said she even met with an attorney. Dan told this to a reporter when Betty called a newspaper to cover the story of the Broderick divorce. When Betty confronted Dan on the stand during the division of their marital property, she wanted him to acknowledge every hardship Betty went through in the early years of their marriage. She brought up the fact he was skiing when she had to go to the hospital before the passing away of their son, but she never once mentioned him hitting Kim when she was a baby until after Dan wasn't alive to contest her. She also never mentioned Dan giving her a black eye until after Dan was gone. Betty was known to hit the children in the spare the rod, spoil the child form of punishment. She spanked the children when they acted up and fought with each other. They got on her nerves. There's a story of Betty chasing little Lee into the backyard with a broken fly swatter. Dan did spank the boys when they were living with him, and he was breaking up a fight, but he did not A-word them. Betty, just like her mother, was miserable as a wife and mother. She told Schwarzenegger on 33, "My needs are always second to Dan's and the baby's. I'm always losing." It wasn't going to get any easier for Betty. Another daughter named Lee was born a year and a half after Kim in July 1971. Less than a year later, they drove across the country to Los Angeles in 1972 for a legal internship, no doubt fighting all the way. While there, she said she heard about San Diego and they loved it, so Dan found a law firm he would eventually work for. Betty loved California so much that she wanted to stay in San Diego with her girls, and she told Dan to go back on his own, but it wasn't possible. As they returned for his final year in Cambridge, Betty already knew she was pregnant. She said she knew fetus termination was legal, and she wanted to get one, but she said Dan cried and begged her not to. He promised to help her more, and he may have wanted to, but he didn't, and Betty was miserable. Betty told Stumbo on pages 66 to 67 when she went into premature labor at 7 months while Dan was gone on a ski trip. She was alone in Boston, miles away from any relatives, with no one to call. She called the police. They drove her to a hospital in a snowstorm. It was a false labor. Dan returned that night, in time to drive her to the hospital a few days later when the child was finally born. Dan was skiing with college friends, and there was no way for Betty, in her condition, to join them. This was part of the networking Dan had to do to achieve their goals. When he found out about the medical scare, he returned home and was with her later when the baby passed away. There was no way for him to know what would happen or to control what happened. But regardless, Betty continues to blame Dan for this. Stemmel said on page 68, ironically, or perhaps provincially, the baby Betty wanted to terminate died anyway, 4 days later. And for reasons clear only to her, she still has not forgiven Dan for not being there when the fear struck, the night the police came. The SOB lied to me. He wasn't there when I needed him most. She told Schwarzenegger on page 39, the doctor filling in for him didn't realize the baby was breech. He left her alone in the room. The baby was born with no one to help. It died a day and a half later. Betty said on page 76, he was 7 pounds and fair and beautiful, and he only lived for a day. But they only let me see him after he was dead. This was in February of 1973. We never named him or buried him, so I still don't know where he is. Dan was home by then, and he arranged for the funeral. Schwarzenegger said on 39, relatives arrived, the baby was cremated. It was a lovely service. Betty said she attempted to unalive herself, and Dan told her to hold on. He was almost finished with college, and they would start their new life in California by that summer. It was something they both could look forward to. In May 1973, Dan graduated, and they moved permanently to San Diego. From the very beginning, Dan knew to reach the success they had planned all along, he would have to leave Gray Carey before 5 years when he would be offered partner. This is what Stumbo said on 36 to 37 about San Diego in the 1970s. Curled around one of the most spectacular half-moon coves in California, La Jolla is the quintessential Southern California dream town, a compact little colony, population about 45,000, of pastel homes streaming down the hillsides to the sea. Property prices range from expensive to outrageous, but it's not hard to crack La Jolla society. It's not about old money. You only need to have money, period, whether you got it yesterday or 3 centuries ago, or at least appear to have it. The La Jolla social structure is less dependent on pedigree and taste than on personality, hustle, and flair. Schwarzenegger said on page 42, Almost everyone in La Jolla came from somewhere else. It was all about what they were or what they owned. Everything was about image. Betty said on page 71, when Dan did finally graduate in 1973 and got a job in San Diego, more than half of his paycheck went to paying down those student loans for his education. This is a lie. Schwartz Noble said the student loan for Harvard was $89 a month. Stumbo said on page 376 that the Harvard loan was $157 a month. Betty said on page 77, I had small children and our financial net worth as a couple was minus hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans that I was somehow half liable for if we split up. This is a lie. Dan's father paid for his education through medical school, and they only took out a loan for the 3 years of law school. Stumbo said on 65, they also took out $20,000 in loans for Harvard, for which, in divorce court almost 20 years later, she would be charged half. By then they only owed $2,000 on the $20,000 they were loaned, and the amount was so little that Dan paid the minimal so he could focus on paying back the larger loans and credit card debt they had together, which had huge interest rates attached to them. And Betty financially benefited from Dan's education just as much as Dan did, so it doesn't make any sense why she would be complaining about paying back what helped Dan to achieve what he did. Stumble said on page 70 his starting pay was about $17,000, says Betty, so for some time life was only a few steps better than their struggling student years. That pay was the same amount any new lawyer would start out at. It didn't seem like his medical background meant much, but the law firm did so much to convince Stan to work for them. Schwartz Noble said on 39 he'd been hired by Gray, Carey, Ames, and Fry, the best law firm in San Diego. Regardless, amortization.org reported that $17,000 in 1973 is about $126,000 in today's money. Even in California, and especially then, it was enough money to start their lives out with. Stumbo summed it up on 70. The Brodericks moved to San Diego after Dan completed a summer clerkship in Los Angeles, where he met Dave Monahan, an attorney at Gray, Carey, and San Diego. Monahan and his then wife Patty persuaded the Brodericks to consider San Diego. Stumbo also said on the same page their first home near the inner city was a cheap, vintage Southern California apartment complex called the Plum Tree, a typical transient's refuge with a narrow courtyard, swimming pool, and neon palms emblazoned across the building front. Plum Tree Complex was an apartment building with a nearby laundry room. It was near a playground. There was a swimming pool. They were near Columbia Catholic Grammar School, where Betty taught 5th grade part-time while the children napped during the day, and she hired a babysitter. It was fine. Stumbo said on page 70, Betty remembered that Dan's brother, Larry, once brought them some patio furniture that doubled as a kitchen set for more than a year. Now, how many people didn't have that kind of furniture? That's fine. They were a young couple in their 20s. That's what you do when you start out on your own. Betty would claim in her book that Dan kept her on a strict allowance, but she's lying. She said Dan got angry at her for spending on little things like installing an electric plug in the bathroom or paying for a cheap dress that cost $35 she claimed she bought on page 93, and that same dress cost $10 on page 183. It does sound impossible to believe, but Betty had no concept about money. She had no comprehension whatsoever what something is worth, and she believes she is too entitled to learn. And considering the massive amount of money she would go through later on in their marriage, it's obvious Betty has no idea what a budget is. By September 1975, Betty was pregnant again, and she saw it as a disaster. She couldn't handle another child, so she went and terminated the pregnancy. Schwartz Noble said on page 41, there was a shootout in front of the pool complex at the Plum Tree. The neighborhood was deteriorating. In the short time that they lived there, Betty didn't want to live in an apartment anymore. She wanted a house with a yard and a washer and dryer. Stumble said on page 70, in a few months they moved to a small rental house in Claremont, a working-class neighborhood across the freeway from La Jolla, where they stayed for another year until an electrical fire burned them out. Betty said she worked at the Black Angus to pay for the washer and dryer, but they bought everything else they wanted for their house on credit. The washer and dryer probably was bought on credit too. And since they lived in apartments before this, they wouldn't have been able to have their own washer and dryer before they moved to the rental house. Betty said Dan bought a TV and she blamed the TV for the fire, of course. They had been using credit cards since Dan was a student, and credit card companies target college students. College students will typically earn more, and the credit card companies get students into debt early. They had a sitter watch the children when they went out, and thankfully no one was hurt, but they did lose everything. Stumble said on page 71 that instead of paying off the furniture they bought on credit, they used the money to make the down payment on the Coral Reef house in La Jolla. It was just a partial down payment, but he said the owner agreed to a balloon payment to be made 5 years later, and they moved into their first real home. It had taken Dan and Betty Broderick only 2 years to arrive at the most celebrated address in town. They lived in another apartment until the house was rebuilt, and then the people didn't want to rent the home anymore. Instead of paying off the bills they had for the furniture that was destroyed in the fire, Dan took all the money they received from the rental insurance, and he used this as a partial down payment for the first real home. So they were heavily in debt, but they had their first and, as Betty said, only home to live in together. Schwartz Noble said on 41, Dan was also proud of the house, a 2-story with a 3-car garage, 4 bedrooms, and a bonus playroom upstairs. It was 3,000 square feet in a large yard. Later they would go even further into debt with a home improvement loan and added a pool in the backyard with a fence. Stumble said on page 42, the house they bought, their first and last as a married couple, was on a street called Coral Reef in a subdivision on the south side of the hills, far from the ocean views. Baja La Jolla, residents fondly called it. The house cost $130,000 and was perfect for a young growing family. It was big and comfortable, with 5 bedrooms and a pretty oversized backyard that spilled into the woody hillside. Betty made it clear on page 87 that she was not impressed with the house. It was a California tract house with very cheap construction, slab and stucco and drywall, low-cost aluminum siding and doors and windows, with no curb appeal. She said it was inferior to the homes they were raised in, but at least it was theirs in a way. It certainly wasn't paid for. Daniel T. Broderick IV was born weeks after moving in, and Dan was busier than ever. On pages 89 to 90, Betty said, as for our mountain of debt, long before the rest of the country learned to live and then fall on credit, our family were pioneers in the movement. She said Dan's brother Larry also lived this way. Betty said that nothing was ever paid for and everything was leveraged and financed to the maximum. Although Betty claimed she worked right up to Brett's birth, Schwartz Noble said on page 43, finally she went on disability after the birth of Danforth because of varicose veins, and she just stayed home. She ran a babysitting service for the La Jolla women and charged them $1 an hour for short periods of time during the day when the women needed a break. Child care was not a regular necessity for them because the women did not work outside the home, or the married ones didn't. Stone said on page 79, by the autumn of 1976, Betty was threatening to divorce him and go back to New York, but she really didn't want a divorce. For all her talk, that was unthinkable. Betty said on page 113, the Johnson family, a Catholic family with 10 kids, and their neighbors, encouraged the couple to attend a marriage encounter. They offered to watch our children so that we could go. It's no surprise they would offer to do this. It must have been a nightmare being neighbors to the battling Broderick. They knew Dan and Betty's marriage was in trouble, and they were willing to help with their children, even though they had a big family of their own, which was very nice of them. Betty said on page 114, it was sometime in 1979 when they went. No, it wasn't, and she knows it wasn't. Stumble said on page 79, one weekend in November 1976, she persuaded Dan to participate in a church retreat for married couples. It was called a marriage encounter. The object was to solidify relationships, and part of the drill was for spouses to write letters to each other on assigned topics. It didn't happen in 1979. It was 1976, so why does Betty lie? She wants to pretend that as soon as Dan made it financially, he left his family, and Betty didn't get to enjoy the wealth they had established. So she sped up the time he made these promises to her, so it would seem like Dan left within a few years of saying these things to her. This marriage unraveled slowly over time, and they both were responsible in the end for allowing their relationship to crumble. Betty said on page 116, we had 2 little girls, and then we had 2 little boys. Rhett wasn't born yet. Betty said on page 115 that part of the marriage counseling involved writing their feelings to each other in books and exchanging the writing. Betty said she still had them with her, but she focused solely in her book on what Dan promised to do for her. Dan acknowledged the sacrifices Betty made and asked for more time to accomplish those financial goals he originally set. Then he told her he would have the ability to be a good husband and father. Stumble on pages 79, 80, and 81 directly quoted Dan and what it must have meant for him to be under pressure. Dan's letters from that weekend provide a glimpse into the mind of a young man of 31 who by then must have been exhausted himself with his own grueling efforts to live up to the expectations of everybody he had ever known, from his parents to his priests, from a demanding God to a demanding wife, not to mention the escalating needs of 3 small children. Dan wrote, "I do not believe in any kind of extension of existence after death. Once I die, the only thing that will be left of me anywhere will be the memories people still alive have of me. I want these memories to be warm, respectful, loving. I tell myself that I've got to earn a decent living, establish myself as a lawyer, acquire certain necessary possessions before I can indulge the luxury of being an attentive, thoughtful person. Experience suggests that unless I change my attitudes now, I will never have time to be and do the most important things. One worldly goal will unplan another until it's too late. You either have left or have resigned yourself to living a separate life with me, and the kids will have gone on their own way, feeling bitter and frustrated at having never known their father. I went through that myself several years ago, and it's miserable. Even now, I believe that our lives together will be much happiness when money ceases being a problem. Happiness is not achieved on some level, it's found in the here and now. People who believe that happiness is eventually achieved will never find it, and Dan and Betty never found that together." Back to him. "I honestly believe that having this ability will make me happy and secure. It will make me a more loving and more lovable person. I may not make it before it's too late. I feel lately that time is running out on me." Dan never knew how prophetic his words were. "I want you to be happy, content, secure. To feel like the sacrifices were worth it. I want to be a responsive, sensitive husband and father. I want to be the type of person who will be genuinely missed when he dies. But I need time. Although I have enjoyed it very much, I won't be advertising it or even discussing it with anyone else." He never would have guessed how many people would eventually read what he wrote. Stumble quotes Betty on pages 82 to 85. "Darling Dan, the opposite of love is indifference. We've never hated each other, but we have, or I feel you have, been guilty of the opposite of love, and it really hurts. I love you and hope we can accommodate each other better." Betty was picking up that Dan was growing more and more distant in the relationship. They had been married 7 years by then. "By the time we go to bed, I'm full of resentment for the lack of closeness and communication during the evening. How can I make love to that?" Critiquing herself, she said, "Betty Broderick is always busy doing something, but never really does anything perfectly. She loves kids, but feels trapped by them all the time." Again, Betty fell in the same trap as her mother. She never felt satisfied as a wife and mother, but also didn't know how to break free from these roles. "I'm an awful listener. You've told me 100 times." Betty referred to seeing red flags in a relationship, but this was a major warning Dan should have known about. If you're dating someone, no matter how hard you try to communicate with them, that person just doesn't seem to hear what you are saying in the relationship. That person doesn't hear you and never will hear you because you really don't matter to that person. She continues, "But you don't seem to be willing to open yourself up. I always feel like you're weighing your words for one reason or another." Betty had a temper that would flare up easily, and Dan knew it. He never could really open up to her because of it. "You never discussed your plans for our house ahead of time." Dan didn't discuss finances with Betty because he was raised in a home where the father made all the decisions. Also, Betty didn't really show any interest in understanding money or even something basic as paying bills. Also, at the time, there wasn't much to decide on. They didn't have much money then, and financial decisions were made to move into their first home, but Betty knew about these plans because she talked about them in her book. If they hadn't put the insurance money up for the down payment on their first home, then they would have returned to renting, which Betty was unhappy with. She may have wanted a better home, but that's what they could afford. "You are the most important person I have in the whole universe, bar absolutely none, and I'd be lost without you." She placed her love for her husband over her children. This is what spouses do. Children are cared for, then they grow up and go off to live their own lives, but the marriage between the parents continue. Husbands and wives should love each other more than their children, but Betty doesn't have an identity outside of being his wife. No one wants to lose their spouse, but she should have more of a foundation in her life. So if she did lose Dan, which she eventually did, then she wouldn't have been so lost without him. "I love you and want to share all that I am with you, but I also need to be loved by you and feel that I know everything there is to know about you like no one else on earth ever had or ever will." That's a lot. Betty sounds like she's a lot. The number one thing I loved about you in the beginning was how much you loved me and showed it. This is a troubling statement by Betty. The "in the beginning" was added by Stumble because she was assisting in betraying Dan as cold throughout the entire marriage, but that's not the case. She loved him because he made her feel loved. It's a sign how much she loved herself and how selfish she remained. Dan wasn't a person to her, but a way for Betty to make herself feel loved. She also wanted them to start devoting 10 minutes a day to writing each other love letters again, just as they'd done in their courtship. That wouldn't happen. In many ways, they returned to their lives living separately from one another, waiting for the day they would become rich. They grew further apart in that time. As a relationship grows with your partner, love becomes quieter as they become more secure. The old version of passionate love turns into companionship. People who are in love do not compete with each other, and they should have found their best friendship. They should have each other's backs and defend each other. Betty and Dan would never find that. Stumble said on page 42 that Dan was then earning only about $30,000 a year at Gray, Carey, Ames, and Fry, one of San Diego's oldest, largest, and most prestigious law firms. On page 86, Stumble said, by 1978, Dan was earning about $32,500 per year at Gray, Carey. It's not that much a difference, but there's still a difference. Betty said on page 106 that Dan was frightened and he started second-guessing himself and his original 5-year plan. This was Betty getting behind Dan and pushing him all the way. Stumble said on page 80 that even now, Betty is proud of her role in persuading her husband that he could succeed. Betty said on pages 106 to 107, I said that success begets success. You have to fake it till you make it. They were heading even further into debt. Dan was willing to start off small in a cheap office space and a metal file cabinet. Betty wouldn't have it. They were going to start out at the top. Betty said on page 106 that Dan got a $500,000 line of credit from the bank to get started. Betty knew about the debt and approved of it. That's over $2 million in today's money. They had no assets to put up against the loan. They were in debt with the house, and the interest rate on the loan must have been outrageous. The next few months provided a glimpse into what the Broderick marriage might have been had these two been consistently interested in building a partnership based on mutual involvement in each other's careers. For the first time, Betty was a welcome participant in Dan's world. Betty helped him design his office with very expensive furniture. His office had a panoramic view of San Diego Bay and the Coronado Bridge. In the end, she says wistfully, he had the prettiest office in town. Stumble said on page 87 that they charged it all on credit cards. On page 86, she said it wasn't only financial ambition that motivated her. She was also trying to save her marriage. Betty told her, I'm a smart woman, and I knew trouble when I saw it. I wanted to get him away from those drunken oafs at Gray Carey. Betty said on page 96, they really were a lot of fun to be around, and were pretty entertaining when they were drunk. In truth, Betty didn't like any of his friends and refused to have them over to her home when she had her dinner party. Lawyer Mike Neal also didn't care for her either and never enjoyed the rare times he spent with her. He told Stumble on page 91, I felt sorry for Dan. He was trying to have a good time, but she was such a wet blanket. She wouldn't even pretend for the sake of the rest of us. The poor guy should have left the B word years before he did. Dan's friend, Mike, was little more understanding with Betty, although she detested him and considered him the ringleader. He told Stumble on page 91 she thought she was the center of the universe. I think she just never felt loved, either by her parents or by Dan. She was like a child, and kids need a dependable link of love. But Betty didn't have that. Not with her family or with Dan either. She just had her social structure to support her, and when that eroded, she just fell apart. Betty referred to a lawyer she didn't like by a fake name in her book. He may have been the Don Manning she disguised the identity of. Betty was trying to pick Dan's friends for him. I insisted that Dan accompany me to one of the Irish dinners the church gave that year. She met a man named Mike Reedy, who wasn't a lawyer, but always wanted to attend Harvard. She wanted Dan to be friends with him like a mother would try to choose her son's friends. Betty was also trying to control his pastimes. It's fine to encourage a partner to try new hobbies together, but these two really didn't have anything in common outside the children. Stumble said on 76, before the arrival of Rhett in 1979, she had another pregnancy termination. On page 104, Betty said in 3 years between Rhett and Danny, I had another miscarriage and a second pregnancy termination. But despite this, I wanted another baby. On page 87, Stumbo said she also decided that red was enough, and her doctor agreed. After his delivery, she had her tubes tied and her varicose veins repaired. She was 32. On 104, Betty said the tubal ligation was in self-defense. I was so tired of being pregnant all the time. 4 children are enough for her to handle on her own. Betty said on 106, Catholic hospitals and doctors wouldn't do tubal ligations back then. On page 87, Stumble said, and this time Dan didn't cry. He didn't even object. Dan bought Betty a necklace with a baby carriage pendant on it. On page 47, Stumbo said intimacy was for reproduction, not pleasure. Swartz Noble, on 53, said Betty was no longer interested in intimacy because Dan was always drunk. She even locked him out once, more than once, much more. As seen in the first movie, Betty often locked Dan out of the house in the bedroom. Dan had to either wake up Kim to let him in or find some place outside to sleep. Although Betty never admitted it, what intimacy the couple shared seemed to disappear once Betty had the tubal ligation. The traditional reasons for intimacy under Catholicism no longer existed. Betty said the Catholic hospital would not perform the tubal ligation, and she had to go to another hospital to have the procedure. From Catholic.com, the act itself is intrinsic ordering toward the generation of children. The couple can never do anything that thwarts the natural purpose of intimacy, since procreation is what intimacy is for. To do so would be to violate human nature and thus to violate God's will, Pope Paul VI says. The Church, nevertheless, in urging men to the observance of their precepts of the natural law, which it interprets by its constant doctrine, teaches that each and every marital act must of necessity retain its intrinsic relationship the procreation of human life. The family planning encouraged by the Church is called natural family planning, or intimacy during a woman's infertile period. Birth control and tubal ligations are considered immoral. Women who are infertile are not called to married life. As far as having a hysterectomy or other health issues, it appears the Church is very vague about answering these concerns. Stumble said on page 87, his new practice was soon thriving. Because of his medical background, he was able quickly to determine which were the most promising malpractice cases, and as his reputation grew, he increasingly accepted none other. Eventually, even settlements in the low 6 figures seldom interested him. Betty, on page 108, said they were not covered by malpractice insurance, and there was a cap on how much you could get. That's a lie. Betty wanted people to believe that Dan went after these poor little family doctors who had to pay Dan's clients out of their pockets. It was the insurance companies who paid out, and they paid out big time for punitive damages. Betty said she loved doctors and acted like she didn't like how Dan made a living, but she didn't mind spending the money Dan made from the settlements. On page 88, Stumble said he bought her a lynx jacket and a diamond necklace, but only as holiday gifts. Betty underplays her materialism. It was all Dan who wanted expensive clothes, and they weren't important to her. Betty on 150 said they had never been with me. Betty pretends that she was poor for years and never had anything, and the children never had clothes, but Dan dressed expensively, and that is not true. Stumble on page 109 said Betty's spending. Louis Farrard is it for suits. Oscar de la Renta is it for dresses. Bob Mackie is it for evening gowns. And for sportswear, Escada. By now, both Brodericks had become serious shoppers. She developed a taste for designer clothes, and so did he. The main difference between them in those days was his affection for larger objects, houses, cars, real estate. On page 95, she continues. She, meantime, enjoyed buying smaller items for her home, the children, or herself. Definitely for herself. Swartz Noble said on page 76, Betty was hungry. It was a wild, ravenous, uncontrollable hunger for food, jewels, furs, clothes, anything that could fill the growing sense of emptiness. Stumble said on page 95, Dan's pleasure in their new wealth was never any less aggressive than Betty's, but he still wanted to spend big bucks on big items, not domestic fluff. The Brodericks argued increasingly over priorities. On page 92, she said, Dan thought Betty was spending too much altogether. On page 92, Stumble said, until the late 70s or early 80s, you were responsible in the way you spent and managed money. You would adhere to a budget, he told her. But after that, he testified, she had become grossly irresponsible. You just wouldn't live within what I thought any reasonable person would consider reasonable expenditures. Betty didn't really adhere to a budget. She was willing to put her spending on hold for a big payoff that would come in the future. She had a huge catalog of items, a wish list. she planned on buying when their ship came in. "I didn't do bills," she once remarked from jail with a lingering pride. "I didn't have any interest in money beyond spending it. I never had any idea of what we even owned." And Betty didn't like the frugal ways of Dan's family. Stumbo on page 113 said they were always tacky, rowdy Irish drunks, she would say without any regard for women. She would talk about how they had no class. His mother would come into La Jolla and embarrass me by shopping for clothes in the aisles of Vaughn's, a supermarket. Betty said, "I used to tease him that his gravestone was going to read, 'Here lies Dan Broderick, who always got maximum flash for minimum cash.' I always thought that was funny because it was totally true." Betty doesn't seem to realize how morbid it is to talk about Dan's grave when she would eventually put him in one. They advanced their part-time Mexican housekeeper, Maria, to 5 days a week. By 1980, Betty even acquired a summertime au pair, a young student from England who performed menial chores and babysat the children in exchange for room and board. And for all their new wealth, Betty and Dan were spending less time together. Stumble on page 89 said she became more interested in the price of a Mercedes than in Dan's staggering annual income tax, more focused on the menu for her next dinner party than in trying to woo Dan into spending a Saturday at the beach with her and the kids. But behind closed doors, they still quarreled, and for all the same old reasons. She felt overworked and underappreciated, and so did he. She nagged, he withdrew. She sulked, he stayed out later. The only real difference was that their quarrels were now less constructive than ever. Betty said they argued because she wanted him to be more involved with the children. But from the late 70s, even Betty's participation with her children's lives was part-time. She ended up being a taxi service for her children as they grew older, and she didn't like it. She said her mother was smart, not getting her license until after the children were grown, but she had all the domestic help her mother had and even more. Stumbo said on page 92, in 1979 she had gotten a real estate license because, and I quote, "I thought it could be my sort of new home job, and I had a talent for real estate, and I was going to help make us even richer." But Dan consistently ignored her advice. Instead, he invested steadily with his brother Larry in Colorado properties, often without consulting her. As he later admitted in divorce court, he simply didn't value her opinions. This is going back to the way he was raised in a patriarchal household. But it was also Betty's fault too, because she refused to show any responsibility when it comes to finances. It's ridiculous that she can do math on paper to get a real estate license, but not understand how to balance her own spending. Betty claimed she passed an accelerated real estate school for one weekend, even though Dan was against it, and was hired by La Jolla real estate firm. Betty claimed she couldn't work for them because Dan wouldn't babysit or let her hire a babysitter. That's a lie. She did have an au pair, and she was constantly going to these society events. Plus, all the children would be in school during the day by the early 80s. La Jolla women did not work. It was a sign of their status. At least the married ones didn't. On page 38, Stumbo said, in La Jolla, to be seriously creme de la creme requires membership in Los Patrones, the most elite sorority in town. Only 50 women at a time can belong, by invitation only, for 7-year terms. Requirements are unwritten, but it is a definite plus to be married to a successful man, or at least married to some man. Betty and her friends said Betty wasn't a socialite, but by this time, anyone outside of San Diego bubble would consider Betty a socialite. Stumble on 41 said, "I never got to the point of luxury. By the time I was in a place to actually have the time to even think about Las Patronas, I was divorced, and they don't take divorcees." On 93, Stumbo said, the English au pair said Betty was very nice and considerate, but the girl complained she was always off to some school or charity event. Little Rat, the girl wrote, cries whenever she leaves the room because she is not there enough. Too often, she told her parents, Mrs. Broderick would simply order in pizza or Chinese before departing to some social function. On 93, Stumbo said, as far as Dan, he was so cold and unfriendly, she said, except for one night when he had found her alone in the jacuzzi. Then she said he had been too friendly, suggesting they go horseback riding the next day, and he would tell everyone he had left his old lady. At about 3 o'clock every afternoon, recalls a former neighbor, Wilma Engel, Betty would just change completely. She would stop laughing and panic and run around the house, picking up all the children's stuff because she said Dan hated to have it underfoot. When he was around, she was completely a different person, so much more quiet and subdued. She seemed afraid of him. Wilma would go on to support Betty in the couple's separation and divorce. She made her feelings known to someone who knew Dan, and word got back to him. He wrote her a letter basically telling her to mind her own business, and he was aware of her inappropriate actions towards someone else. She took it as blackmail and immediately showed the letter to her husband. Saying she was afraid may not have really captured what was going on. It was more like Betty was intimidated by Dan. For all her putting him down, she seemed to live with a fear that she wasn't completely worthy of him, and that insecurity would build throughout the marriage. Also, Betty enjoyed being the center of attention, and it's almost like she was competing with Dan and his success. On page 79, Stumbo said, I tried to get that guy to say, yes, I love you, and you look pretty, and I'm happy with you, and I'm proud of you, and you did a good job with the kids, or dinner, or the house, or anything. But no matter what the hell I did, he always had the air of, well, it could be better. All I ever wanted from that damn man was 5 minutes of eye contact a day. Betty wanted far more than that, but it's obvious that Dan was never going to be able to give her the attention she craved. He was never going to be the man she wanted him to be. He was never going to make her happy. In the same way, Betty never told Dan how proud she was of him. On pages 93 to 94, Stumbo said, Dan was a different person around Betty. Said his friend Laurel Summers. She was always so critical, nagging. He seemed to have a hard time even smiling when she was around. After he met Linda, he was so much more looser, warmer. That's when I realized I just hadn't ever seen Dan happy before. Stumble continued. Betty continued to threaten him with divorce, although she says today that she never meant it. There is a scene in the movie where the actress playing Kim mouths the words, let's just get a divorce, with actress Meredith Baxter Burney, because they heard Betty threaten it so much. On page 138, Betty twists an argument she had with Dan. He felt like he was just a walking paycheck to her, and he told her all he did was pay the bills and do his job. She said she told him to just leave and send them the checks. Betty didn't know how to handle expenses, and she certainly didn't want him to leave. But he was telling her that his only value to her was what he made and what he paid for. She twisted that into, he said that's all he had to do, when she wanted him to be more involved with the kids, her go-to complaint. She wanted Dan to be more involved with her, but when they were together, they ended up fighting. There were reports that he left the home in 1982, but Betty was able to use the children to get him to return. Schwartz Noble said on 46, for the first time, people who knew them noticed she was becoming critical of Dan in public. Small stuff, just taking him down a peg, correcting his grammar, making fun of his early Pennsylvania training, that kind of thing. No, this isn't true. Betty called Dan homosexual slurs in front of his friends and other acquaintances when he and Betty went out. She looked for ways to cut him down in public and in private. He was becoming more successful, and Betty was afraid of losing her control over him. Then he would pretend to introduce Betty as his current wife, and people around them would laugh uncomfortably, but everyone knew their marriage was in trouble. Betty said in her book she thought he was a homosexual because he was fashionable, used hair products, and he hung out with other men all the time, but Betty spent all of her time with women. Betty was the daughter of a construction worker, albeit one who owned his own business. She wasn't used to refinements in a man like Dan. Her friends warned her about acting that way, but she brushed it off and said Dan didn't care. As his income increased, the trouble in the marriage also increased. Stumble on page 92 said, no story better reflects the old saying that money can't buy happiness than the saga of Dan and Betty Broderick. How many of us believe that if we just had more money, we would be happier? It was the exact opposite with Dan and Betty. Money just became another tool for them to fight over. On 66, Stumbo said, money was always the goal, as she tells it, without shame. I always thought Dan would make a great U.S. Senator or President someday, and I thought it would be great to be First Lady. It was more than just money. It was about status and power and being able to influence others that Betty craved. On pages 96 to 97, Stumbo said, at the same time, she had begun extending her social skills to include elegant little omelet brunches just for the mothers. She hired chefs and sometimes string quartets. Her backyard tables were graced with fresh flowers. She served the finest champagne, and her invitations were always dispatched on the most expensive engraved Tiffany stationery, just like a mother had taught her. She also began to escalate her charity activities. Years later, amid the hundreds of clippings she had saved over the years, were pictures of Betty from the society pages with and without Dan. On page 41, Stumble said Betty told her, "Of course I wasn't a La Jolla socialite. I didn't have time," said Betty Broderick later from jail. She had time. By anyone else's standards, she was a socialite. She was a person of a high social class who was married to an important man, and she spent the majority of her time attending parties and social events. And she had this lifestyle for some years. She claimed she was going to open a baby boutique. Broderick said on 118, "In addition to having a business of my own, it would give me an excuse to travel to Europe for a buying trip. Odd thing for a mother of 4 kids to plan on doing. Who was going to be at home with their children?" She said she had a judge's wife for a partner who would deal with all the business and bookkeeping aspects, which Betty needed because she knew nothing about money. Schwartz Noble on page 52 said it was going to be called Cherub's Children's Store. Betty on page 118 claimed that she would work the front of the store and haul out her New York upbringing. "I have been raised around and modeled in some of the most exclusive boutiques and stores in the country." She said Dan told her no, so she didn't. Betty said Dan didn't want to lose control of her, but it was just the opposite. It was Betty who didn't want to lose control of Dan. Betty said Dan refused to fund the business, but years later Betty would have access to large sums of money and never attempted to do anything on her own. Betty had no drive and motivation for herself. She never had any follow through. She skipped from job to job at the beginning of the marriage and spent her time building her social status as Dan's career took off. On page 93, Betty said, "Mind you, I was not a feminist. I wanted to be a wife and mother. Feminists are wives and mothers. They are feminists because they are wives and mothers. They also want to be more than just playing roles in other people's lives, and they want their daughters to have better lives." On page 98, Betty wrote, "When we moved to Coral Reef, I changed parishes to go to St. Bridget's in Pacific Beach." On page 97, Stumbo said, at about the same time she changed churches, switching from the tiny Catholic church in La Jolla, Mary Star by the Sea, to the larger, popular La Jolla Presbyterian Church. She did it, she said later, because the Presbyterians had more programs for children. But too, she remarked, "It's amazing that in a community as cosmopolitan, as sophisticated as La Jolla, at least half the people who attend the Catholic Church are the Mexican maids." Betty was very elitist. She wasn't going to go to church and sit next to people she deemed to be inferior to her. On page 77, Stumbo said, but Betty wasn't happy. Privately, she was lonelier and more disillusioned than she had ever been. Not because of money problems, not because of her heavy workload, but because of Dan. Betty wanted intimacy, emotional bonding, sharing. Dan didn't know what the hell she was talking about, since he thought he was sharing just fine. Betty on page 93 said, "I did not spend my marriage trying to wrest power and control away from him." Yes, she did. Betty did not want to lose control of Dan, and she also seemed to want to compete with his adulation. There was a resentment on Betty's part, even a jealousy of Dan's accomplishments. She wanted to outshine him. Betty on page 112 said, "Everyone was impressed with Dan Broderick, no more than himself." Stumbo on pages 93 to 94 said the Brodericks couldn't even agree on which new house to buy. He wanted a big mansion with an acre of land around it, said Betty. She wanted to live in La Jolla, but Dan was more interested in other parts of San Diego, such as Point Loma, with its spectacular sea cliffs, or the island of Coronado, miles away. They never would resolve the dispute. For the next 5 years, despite his escalating income, they remained at Coral Reef, gridlocked literally until the day he walked out, each one still blaming the other for the impasse. On page 109, Stumbo said, in divorce court years later, Dan said that they looked at about 100 different houses between 1979 and 1985, sometimes as many as 8 to 10 in a single week. But he blamed Betty for showing him homes that were too expensive. Betty said in her book, Dan sent her out to look at $1-million homes, but it wasn't Dan who wanted a home that expensive. It was Betty who wanted the expensive house. This is where the marriage really started to fall apart. Betty was looking in La Jolla, Mission Hills, and Coronado areas for a home she wanted, but Dan didn't want to live there, and he didn't like the houses. Dan wanted a home like his father had, and brought Betty to see the house he would eventually buy. Betty hated it. For all the homes they looked at, they couldn't find a compromise. Betty was determined to get her way, but Dan refused. Simmering resentments came to a boil when he decided one day, without consulting her, to buy 2 lots in Fairbanks Ranch, a new glamour development north of La Jolla. She exploded. She hated Fairbanks Ranch. It was tacky, all flash, and no class. Nouveau rich. It's a very upscale area now, but it was still in development then. Betty said Dan paid $1 million in cash for the lots. That's not possible. He made $1 million that year. How could he, with all of his other bills, afford that? This couple never paid for anything outright. Everything was on credit and financed to the hill. According to Stumbo, on page 276, Betty received her half for the sale of the lots, which was $222,000, that she had to pay her lawyer out of. That's easily $700,000 in today's money. Betty and Dan were invited to attend the wedding of a lawyer who once lived near them. She said he had a wife, she means by then an ex-wife, and 2 sons, but she doesn't say who it was. He cheated on his wife and later married his secretary at the Bahia Resort on the Bay. Betty refused to go, and she said she refused to go out of loyalty to the ex-wife. Betty on page 101 said, I felt sorry for her. I couldn't imagine surviving that. The rejection, the shame, the fear, the guilt at your own inadequacy, and the heartbreak. That's the worst of it, the endless heartbreak. Betty's circle of friends were quickly disappearing into the ex-wives club, and that's one club she didn't want to join. She was resentful that the other women didn't do the same when the same thing happened to her years later. Betty on 102 said, years later, very few of the wives had the conviction not to attend Dan and Linda's wedding out of loyalty to me. The women were trying to hold on to their own marriage and please their husbands, even as the same fate befell every one of them. Betty knew this because she kept up with their lives. Betty said something very important in her book. On page 102, she said, I've noticed that women rarely stick together like men do. I think it's because they don't feel in control of their own lives. Women who are dependent on men have to defer to them rather than believing in and developing their own power. On page 94, Stumbo said, now with his blow-dried hair, his new contact lenses, his wonderful smile, his fuller face, Dan Broderick was a man any woman would look twice at, even if he hadn't been a respected millionaire. Dan had a nose job and Betty had her overbite repaired with braces. She told Stumbo on page 76 the dentistry changed the entire shape of her face. I never looked like me after that. Her face changed considerably. It gave her a more matronly appearance. On page 126, Betty said the first time I heard of Linda Kolkena was at a birthday party during the 82-83 holiday season when I overheard Dan say, isn't she beautiful? She told Stumbo on page 99 she thought it was sometime in early 1983. It was well into the year of 83 when Dan first saw Linda. She would try to say later that Dan was having an affair with Linda for 2 years by that time. He left the marriage, but it was less than a year. It definitely wasn't the 3 years Schwartz Noble would claim. Betty said she never heard Dan say that about anyone before. He never even said that about Betty. On page 99, Stumble wrote, no big deal maybe coming from a different man, but Dan Broderick never said things like that about women, says Betty. He was never a womanizer. He had no sense of himself as sensual at all. With those 3 words, Dan Broderick had innocently tapped that reservoir of instinct, of danger alert that all women understand. Betty's reaction was odd. It would have been understandable if she confronted Dan and asked him what he was doing calling another woman attractive in front of his wife, or even not in front of his wife. Dan needed to keep his married eyes to himself. She didn't do that. She also didn't confront Linda. Instead, Betty scrutinized Linda's appearance and decided the wife was the better option. It was the reaction of a teenage girl sizing up her competition. Stumbo, 199, wrote, Betty's reaction to Linda was, I was shocked that this was the girl he thought was so beautiful. She was just another skinny little bimbo with a gap between her front teeth. She had all this hair, all poofed up like Brigitte Bardot, bobby pins and the whole bit, not a streak of blonde in it. I was, to say the least, underwhelmed. Betty actually compared Linda to Brigitte Bardot, one of the most sensual women to ever walk this planet, and she said she wasn't worried. Betty was not intimidated. She was obviously just another 19-year-old airhead looking for a rich husband. She couldn't hold a candle to me. I was prettier. I was smarter. I was classier. It never occurred to me that Dan would be stupid enough to throw his family away for his office girl. It was just too much of a cliche to believe. That night she asked him, as casually as I could, whom he had been talking about. He blinked at her. At first, uncomprehending, she recalls, then remembered. Oh, he said, just some new girl at the office, a receptionist. He went back to his reading, and she put it on the back burner of her mind. Actually, she snuck around and found out all she could about Linda. Schwartz Noble, on page 84, said, but Linda was a kid who couldn't type and had never even finished high school. That's not true. Linda couldn't type, but she did finish high school, and there were so many errors in her book it became impossible to use her book as a reliable source. And the reason for this is in her opening. She wrote, like Betty, I found a prince who was planning to become a doctor. I saw him through college and medical school, military service, and internship. 14 years and 2 children later, I watched him walk out and marry a beautiful blonde while he was still married to me. He didn't pay child support. I never got over it, but I didn't unalive him. She doesn't explain why he didn't pay child support, even though he would be obligated to do so, or how he could marry another woman while still married to her. Regardless, Schwartz Noble went on to marry yet another doctor and dedicated her book to him, the child they had together, and her husband's 4 children from another relationship. When she says she saw him through college and medical school, exactly what does that mean? Did she support him financially or help pay for his education? What did she provide to his achievements that he would not have been able to accomplish without her help? There are women who financially support their families and help pay for their husband's education, so they are responsible for that success. But that's not Betty. Women like Schwartz Noble and Betty don't just happen to marry men like doctors and lawyers who will be big earners. This is what they're looking for. They can talk about Linda being a gold digger, but really they're no different. They're just older and younger versions of each other. Women need to be honest with their motives. It's obvious how resentful Schwartz Noble was because she attacked Linda's character in the same way she wanted to attack the beautiful blonde who married her first husband. Neither Schwartz Noble nor Stambo ever met Linda, and although they talked to Linda's family, they extracted heavily from Betty's jealousy and from the bitterness they carry from their own experiences. That's not to justify women having affairs with married men, but Linda was very young, and the adultery doesn't mean she was less of a human being. While Schwartz Noble assisted Betty in dehumanizing Linda in her book, Stumbo, from pages 100 to 104, gives a more objective description of the young woman Linda was. Linda Bernadette Kolkena was, in fact, a high school graduate, and when she first met Dan Broderick, she was not 19 years old, but 21, maybe even closer to 22. She was the youngest of 4 children, born to Arnoldus Johannes Everdina Bernadetta Kolkena, Dutch immigrants who came to the United States in the 50s and settled in Salt Lake City. Her father, now retired, worked for 30 years as a freight handler for a trucking company until one of his lungs collapsed. Linda's oldest sister, Margaret Seitz, said theirs was a small, clean home filled with love but no luxuries. Her family were devout Roman Catholics. 4 prayers were recited at every meal, and Christmas was observed as a strictly religious holiday, not a festivity. Youngsters were never taught to even believe in such fancies as Santa Claus. After a 2-year battle with breast cancer, Everdina Kolkena died at age 36. Maggie was in 16, Linda 11. After 6 months of mourning, Arnoldus Kolkena, informal, courtly, old-world fashion, went into Salt Lake's substantial Dutch community in search of a proper mother for his children. Our expectation was to grow up and have children. You work to work, not to have a career. You weren't cultured that way. The man would always be the breadwinner. All Linda ever really wanted to be was a wife and mother. She was the kind of person who walked into restaurants and asked to hold other people's babies. She was very traditional. Linda worked for the Delta training program for about 8 months, but was fired in February 1982 for conduct unbecoming a Delta employee. From there, Linda worked briefly for an Atlanta attorney. Since she had never learned to type, she was a Girl Friday, a receptionist who also performed some semi-paralegal chores. Linda followed a boyfriend on a job transfer to San Diego. That relationship ended shortly thereafter, but she remained in San Diego, working as a pool receptionist in the same commercial building where Dan Broderick had his offices. On page 103, Stumble said, in later years, old friends of Dan and Betty would remark on how much the 2 women even looked alike, right down to their teeth. Not really. Betty and her supporters wanted to believe that Dan replaced Betty with a newer version of her with Linda, and therefore Dan was still attracted to Betty, but found someone who was younger than her blonder version. Linda was new to California During that time, many women were dyeing their hair blonde to some degree. She streaked it blonde, but she never had the platinum blonde hair of Betty. And just like the uniform Betty wore when she went to school and college, these women in La Jolla lived in a bubble and wore a similar designer wardrobe. Betty and Schwartz Noble would claim that Linda purposely wore the same outfit Betty wore for a Christmas photo, but the color combination Betty wore was typical for Christmas festivities, and Linda wore it years afterward. Linda had no reason to look like Betty. Dan found her very attractive without the designer clothes and blonde hair. Betty and Linda did not look alike, except for the fact they were both attractive women. It's hard to see the similarities unless you simply want to see it. On page 100, Stumbo said, that summer she took the children on a 5-week camping trip throughout the Northwest. Dan flew up to visit them one weekend, and Betty says he was colder and more detached than ever. They argued. Steaming, she drove him back to the airport and told him to get lost. Betty, on page 131, says that Betty takes a trip with the children through the national parks of the West. Dan had to work, but flew out twice to meet them. Betty said he was acting strangely, and she blew up at him. She and the children returned later from the trip, and Betty couldn't reach Dan by phone. On the drive to Newport Beach to attend a wedding, Betty said he told me that he was bored with his life, bored with me, that he didn't love me anymore, that I was old, fat, ugly, and boring. Even Stumbo said Betty was exaggerating, which she often does. She would later repeat it in court and cry on the witness stand as she did. Either way, it was Betty Broderick's clear impression of where her marriage now stood. Her husband was either having an affair or thinking about it with who she calls the office bimbo. What probably happened was Dan told her he wasn't happy in the marriage. Betty didn't understand what he was talking about. What's happiness? They're married. They have children. They own a lot of expensive things, and they're well known in the community. Who needs happiness? Certainly Betty wasn't happy. She doesn't even understand what that is, and maybe that definition is different for everyone. But the dictionary definition is a place or level or state where success or enjoyment is obtained. Dan wrote her many years ago that he was trying to obtain a level of success that would allow him to be a more involved husband and father. He thought when he reached a certain financial level that everything would fall into place and he would find happiness, but it didn't happen. The concept of happiness is new for most of humanity, and almost everyone has trouble achieving it. It's not so much a level to someday reach, but it can be found in the here and now. Finding happiness in the moments we're alive will start filling minutes, and minutes will fill hours, and hours will fill the days, and weeks, and years. And before you know it, a person has achieved happiness by realizing he had it with him all along. Betty told a story on page 66 to Stumbo about a Christmas they had back in Boston. This was when the girls were little and she was pregnant. They had sliding glass windows in their apartment and a glass-top coffee table. The toddlers would leave their fingerprints on the glass as they were learning to walk around the apartment, and Dan, having OCD, would get the Windex glass cleaner and clean off the glass as soon as he walked in the door. So for his Christmas gift, Betty bought him a whole cardboard case of Windex and wrapped it up and put it under the tree. She said they didn't have much money then, and that's what she could afford. When he unwrapped it, he started laughing, and Betty said that he loved it. They didn't have any money, but they made a happy memory just being together. They should have made spending time together a requirement, rather than spending time apart to make money, which didn't buy them happiness anyways, and they let all this time disappear when they should have built memories together. When Dan made that $1 million a year, they set as their goal, they had nothing between them anymore. Dan had his world, and Betty had hers, and someone had just entered Dan's world to fill the void Betty never occupied. Stumbo said on 105, it was a warm September evening in 1983 when Dan came home late again and told her over dinner that he had hired someone to help him in the office beginning the following week. Linda hadn't been at her job for more than a few months before Dan Broderick, then 38, hired her as his personal assistant. Betty was already on alert. The miniseries depicted Dan as stumbling over Linda's name like he was trying to pretend not to know her, but that didn't happen. Betty told Stumbo on page 106, I told him to get rid of the little B word by October 1st or get out. Dan told her he wasn't going to fire her and she could leave the house if she was so unhappy. This was a sign of change in the dynamics of their relationship. Mother no longer ruled. Stumbo said, so much for Betty Broderick's perceived view of her authority over Daniel T. Broderick III. The nerd had disappeared forevermore, along with Betty Broderick's confidence that the ground beneath her feet was sure. Before the Blackstone Ball in November 1983, Betty gets mad at Dan when they went on a trip to New York in an attempt to relive those earlier moments in their marriage. And they did by fighting and arguing as usual. Stumble said on page 110, during a trip they took to New York City a few weeks after Dan came home with his new Corvette, Betty caught him at the St. Regis Hotel lobby calling Linda. He told her it was only business. She found Dan talking to Linda on the phone. She goes down to Elizabeth Arden and buys a Bob Mackie dress off the rack on sale for $8,000. That's about $25,000 in today's money. Although Betty would try to portray herself as a meek housewife, she was the exact opposite. Bob Mackie designed original dresses for people like Cher and Madonna. On page 153, Betty said, I showed him my dress with the price tag still on it, and he nearly died, which made me feel a little better. Stumble said from pages 110 to 111, she walked down the street to the Elizabeth Arden salon, where she bought her first Bob Mackie evening gown, a pink and lavender concoction of sequins and flounces, sale priced at $7,000. Okay, in today's money, that's over $22,000. And the SOB damn near died, she recalls with satisfaction. Normally, these dresses cost $10,000. That's over $32,000 in today's money. That's more than revenge shopping. Betty always spent money lavishly, and they fought about it. There were no loving memories relived in New York. They returned home more distant than ever. Dan showed no real interest in how she looked or even attending the Blackstone Ball, for that matter. He didn't care for it and only went because he said he felt like he had to. Betty loved going to these parties and social events. It was hurt when Dan didn't want to go with her. Betty, I knew you would have the best dress at the party, someone told her. Betty always wanted to be the center of attention. Betty's birthday was November 7th, 1983. She had a cake with her children, and Dan doesn't come home until much later. Betty said she attempted to unalive herself. She said she tried to cut her wrist and swallowed every pill in the house. On page 115, Stumble said, in reality, of course, it is unlikely that Betty seriously intended to unalive herself. She was only trying to get her husband's attention in a pathetically immature way, and she knows it. Betty says Dan bandaged her wrist and told her that children needed her. What would they do without her? The next day, she goes out with everyone on a boat trip with neighbors. It's really hard to say with Betty because you never get a sense that you really see who Betty really is. She's always wearing a mask, the smile on her face that's not really smiling. On page 116, Stumbo said, November 22nd was Dan's 39th birthday, and one of her most loyal friends, Vicky Curry, sat her down and talked to her hard. Vicky told me to fight back, says Betty. She told me to do what wives are supposed to do. Be confident, romantic. She persuaded me to get all dressed up that day and go down to Dan's office with a bottle of champagne for a birthday surprise. On page 117, Stumble said, it was a new office. Dan had so prospered since he first went into private practice 5 years earlier that he had moved to larger quarters in a more prestigious, high-rise building. It was just one more measure of the distance between their daily working worlds that Betty had never been there before. In his office were balloons, remnants of a cake, and an empty bottle of champagne. Dan seemed to really feel at ease with Linda. He wasn't as anxious anymore. On page 114, Stumble said, by now he was a changed man. He was no longer cranking out the work, and some days she would arrive to find his office a clutter of food wrappers and empty wine bottles. Apparently, Dan's OCD disappeared. Dan and Linda were gone, and although Betty waited in the office for hours, they never returned. Betty drives home and goes directly to his closet. On page 118, Stumble said, trip after trip she made to the backyard. Her children watched, wide-eyed. By now her friend Vicky had arrived and begged her to stop. She piled his clothes in the yard and set his clothes on fire. She does this right in front of her children, which must have been very frightening and embarrassing for them. Betty said in her book that she regretted doing it in the presence of her children. But when Betty's in a rage, she doesn't think about how she hurts others. Now everyone knew the Broderick marriage was in deep trouble. Stumble said on pages 118 to 119, she was in fact so embarrassed about burning his clothes that, according to later trial testimony, she even lied about it the next day to Maria, her faithful maid, telling her that Dan came home at 2 a.m., stinking drunk, and burned his own clothes. Betty claimed the au pair would return from her weekends off and see holes in the wall, and Betty blamed Dan. It was just as likely Betty who did the damage. Dan simply went upstairs after he returned home. Betty follows him to talk in the bedroom. Instead of fighting, Dan was oddly quiet. On page 118, Stumbo says, he said the party was innocent, that they had gone to lunch, then Linda had gone shopping. He had been in a deposition. This was looked into, and apparently it was true, but Dan and Linda would eventually go on to have a physical affair. What may have happened at this time is there would be an emotional affair before the physical affair began. Emotional affairs start when someone turns to another person outside of the marriage for emotional support. More often than not, affairs happen at the workplace because it's just the place we spend so much time at. Dan and Linda were spending a lot of time together, and he was attracted to her. Apparently, she idolized him. On page 114, Stumbo said by late 1983, she, the secretary, later told defense investigators the affair between Dan and Linda was common knowledge in downtown legal circles. The pair took long lunches together and sometimes didn't return to the office in the afternoons at all. They drank together after work at the downtown pubs. They attended legal functions together. Linda was especially indiscreet, talking openly to other women in the office about her latest plans with Dan from the secretary. Dan later fired the secretary after she confronted Dan with her opinions about his relationship with Linda. She told him to tell his wife or cut it out. It sounds like there was a group of older secretaries who worked in the same building with the younger office assistants who the lawyers were leaving their wives for. Apparently, the secretaries didn't like the office assistants and vice versa. The secretary was later let go without explanation and without a severance pay. Sometimes it pays not to stick your nose where it doesn't belong. Dan told Betty to cancel the Christmas party, and she seemed to be confused as to why he would cancel it. On 149, Betty said, since I couldn't tell the reason why we weren't having it, I gave no explanation. Betty said Dan knew she loved giving parties and canceled it to hurt her. People obviously must have known after setting his clothes on fire that the marriage was in trouble, and there's no way he was going to put on a show for everyone trying to pretend everything was okay when it wasn't. Betty refused to accept that the marriage was falling apart. There's a photo of her sitting at a table on New Year's Eve after she said Dan abandoned her and slept in the car. Betty smiling away like she doesn't have a care in the world. Stumble said on page 97, by 1983, they were also bound by their tax return, for in that year, at least in the eyes of the IRS, Dan and Betty Broderick had become bona fide millionaires. They had finally made it, but they destroyed their marriage getting there. On page 119, Stumbo said, Dan Broderick was like a cat caught by highway headlights, frozen by indecision, or a dog in heat, unable to turn any suitor away, or a particular suitor. There are many reasons why people will have affairs. Some believe that monogamy in itself is unnatural. Many people see cheating as a symptom of someone who can't control his urges and he is weak. They see it as a moral failing. Betty assumed he was having a midlife crisis. On page 117, she said, when you hit around 40, you start to wonder where your youth went and what you did with it. Betty read books about midlife crisis and talked to Dan about it. On 120, Stumbo said, periodically she saw pictures of Dan and his pretty legal assistant in local legal publications, but she ignored them. Betty seemed willing to tolerate his relationship with Linda as long as he didn't leave the marriage. She was willing to turn a blind eye to the affair rather than lose her lifestyle. Stumbo said in La Jolla, as elsewhere else in the world, where career lives are threatened, the common answer is to look the other way. Do not panic. The husband won't risk the cost, embarrassment, and inconvenience of leaving the home. From 111 to 112, she said, one of Betty's friends, for example, another attorney's wife, had endured her own husband's semi-public affair with an office girl. But that story ended neatly, when one of the other wives in the partnership marched into the men's lavish legal suite and ordered the boys to clean up the mess at once. In other words, get rid of the girl. On 112, Stumble continued, the other long-suffering wife had even been rewarded by her philandering husband with a new Porsche, because he knew he owed her, said Betty. On page 40, Stumbo said, the big D is a common La Jolla euphemism for divorce. Few words beyond menopause and cancer have a harsher, more final impact on a polite luncheon. La Jolla is, at heart, still an old-fashioned place where traditional marital roles are at least superficially observed. In most cases, the husband won't go as far as to leave the wife. He will simply keep the girlfriend on the side, and that is a widely acceptable solution. On page 120, she said the answer was as old as the hills. However discontented Dan Broderick may have been at home, and however thrilled he was by his afternoon and evening trysts with this beautiful young woman who so adored him, he was not yet anywhere close to committing the unthinkable act of walking out on his wife and children, of scandalizing his family, of sinning in the eyes of the church, no matter how uncool he thought that church was. What's more, a divorce he knew would cost him a fortune. And yet there were plenty of divorces happening. The divorce rate was increasing. On page 136, Broderick said, couples were splitting up left and right, and I didn't want a divorce. Stumbo blamed feminists in the no-fault divorce that allowed men to leave the marriage without being blamed for ending the relationship due to the affair. She said before the no-fault divorce, men had to move to a one-bedroom apartment while the wives kept most of the money and assets, at least until the children were adults. That was never going to apply to men like Dan Broderick because they made far too much money. Now, 80% of divorces are led by women. Women no longer need to prove adultery or domestic A-word in order to leave a marriage, and those issues are hard to prove for couples who are poor to middle class. This allowed women to leave what could be a life-threatening situation. And yes, feminists fought to allow women to do this. On page 112, Stumbo said she looked at her old friend Patty Monahan, now limited to $2,700 per month support after 22 years of marriage, a pretty, aging woman with bleached hair, wearing miniskirts and too much makeup, now forced back into the dating game of her youth in pursuit of a new relationship to replace the one she had lost. That's about $9,000 in today's money. Betty didn't want a divorce. She did not want to end up like one of those women. Stumbo on page 108 said, instead she went into a fierce retreat. She swallowed her ultimatum and her anger and tried to pretend that there was no Linda Kolkena at the office. Betty was watching her women friends, who were also the wives of attorneys, get divorced and be replaced by their secretaries or office assistants. Why? These were the women these men were spending so much of their time with. They were workaholics, and these young women didn't have any family responsibility. Plus, they knew all about their work because they were paid to spend all day with them. They were able to speak the same language. On page 125, Broderick said about Linda Kolkena, she was available after work to sit behind him in bars and laugh at his jokes and gaze at him like he was a superhero. But even Betty admits that there were problems between her and Dan long before the affair started. On page 94, Betty said, before, during, and after Linda, I was a lonely woman in my marriage. Schwartz Noble on 68 said, in the voice of Betty, maybe I've been too busy with the kids. Maybe I've taken him for granted. On pages 110 to 111, Betty claimed, at home I helped him with ideas and listened while he practiced his arguments. At the time we were really happy and really together as a couple. No, this is a lie. They were not happy, and Betty had no interest in Dan's work. All she was concerned with was spending the money he made. It wasn't Betty who was listening to Dan. It was Linda. On pages 126 to 127, Stumbo said, not until years later would Betty finally decide that Dan had been purposely flaunting his affair with Linda at the same time he denied it in an effort to drive her to divorce him. He was trying to make me hate him. He wanted out. He wanted a divorce, but he didn't want to be the guy. He wanted me to file. That's possible. For Dan, Linda was the catalyst to finally end a bad marriage. On page 126, Stumbo said, one morning, for example, as he lay in bed with his eyes shut, seemingly asleep, she says that he began murmuring, Linda, Linda. She stared at him, aghast. He wasn't asleep. She could tell. She knew it. Schwartz Noble said, another night, he came home late and, she swears still, deliberately laid his hand on the pillow near her face, and it smelled of between Linda's legs. I was so grossed out. Stumble said the same thing. His hands reeked of between Linda's legs odor. It was possible. It's also possible that Betty assumed Dan was with Linda right before he returned home and only imagined it in her head. She would later imagine them being together constantly and made up these sensual scenarios in her head. She became obsessed by them. Betty wouldn't confront him, but she was confiding in others about Dan and Linda. On page 111, Stumbo said during these months, too, she began to sound the alarm to her friends. She was everywhere, at school functions, in the La Jolla boutiques, in the supermarkets, telling them all of her suspicions that Dan was having an affair. She said in her book that other women would call her and let her know when they saw Dan and Linda together, and it didn't help her mental health at all. What she was imagining in her mind was bad enough. She didn't need these women calling her and confirming her fears. Betty was trying to outlast the affair, and she hoped Dan would just get over his midlife crisis. Stumbo said on 120, but downtown, Dan and Linda's friends looked on with increasing concern. Dan seemed more strained each day, and Linda was now crying openly over his refusal to leave Betty. On page 122, she said, and finally Linda tried. She gave Dan an ultimatum: fish or cut bait. If he didn't divorce Betty, she was going to begin dating other men. On page 122 again, he wouldn't. Instead, he told Linda to go ahead, to get on with her life. Dan could be cold-hearted once he made a decision, said Laurel Summers, Dave Monahan's closest female companion after his divorce from Patty. On page 122 again, Stumbo said, but Dan didn't tell Linda to find a new job, too, nor did she volunteer to quit. What for? They both asked friends. He needed her services. She loved her job. They could handle it. Whether they were hypocrites or just fools will always be an open question, though all evidence points to the former. So enter Steve Kelly, one more casualty of the Broderick affair. Kelly is a handsome, 30-something editorial cartoonist for the San Diego Union, and an aspiring comedian who has appeared on the Johnny Carson show. A look-alike for actor Richard Chamberlain in his younger days, Kelly met Linda Kolkena at a realtor's office in the spring of 1983 while they were both shopping for condominiums. For Kelly, it was love at first sight. Stumbo on 123 said their relationship lasted for more than a year, maybe. But Linda never told him that she had been or was still having an affair with her boss. Linda finally broke down and admitted to the affair. For months, she told Kelly she and Dan had spent their lunch hour in her little apartment in Ocean Beach. Kelly confronted Dan to make sure the relationship was over, and he was met by a very cold, stern man, just the same way Dan's father was. On 124, Stumbo said Linda was planning to spend the weekend at Palm Desert with Dan, helping him on a case. She had to go, she told Kelly. It was her job. He told her either to commute daily or forget him. She chose to forget him, though they remained friends until her death. Talking about Dan and Betty, Stumbo on page 125 said that summer they even took a week-long vacation to London together. It was their first trip to Europe alone. Betty said she hated it. She was basically doing everything Dan wanted to make him happy, and hanging out in bars rather than going to the museums and places she wanted to go. It was all, yes, Dan, whatever you want, Dan. Apparently on the plane back to the States, Betty couldn't take it anymore and turned to Dan to ask him about his office girl. And any good memories they had on that trip went right out the door. Betty couldn't help herself. It was her nature. One of her friends, who probably had been where Betty was, must have advised her to go talk to someone for her mental health, because Betty would not have done that on her own. Betty thought only crazy people received therapy. On 116, Stumbo said she went to see a psychologist she had met earlier at a church seminar on self-esteem. But after 4 sessions, Betty quit therapy. Although in later years a judge would order her to seek therapy if she wanted even visitation rights with her children, that was the first and last time Betty would voluntarily visit any therapist, free of the angry defiance of a woman obliged. As one doctor friendly to her later remarked during her divorce trial, Betty only plays at therapy. The doctor explained later that Betty pulled information from the therapy sessions not to help herself, but to use it to manipulate people in her life. On 128, Stumble said Dan and Betty Broderick seemed to be a closer family unit than ever, thanks mainly to housing matters. First, they were obliged to move from their Coral Reef home into a temporary rental because Coral Reef had a crack in its foundation that would take months to repair. Not really. Schwartz Noble on page 76 said, Betty took off when they moved into the rental. She said, I did all the packing, now you can do all the unpacking. She went out the door in one of her rages. Dan and the children had no idea where she went. Of course, she returned later, but it's just typical of their fighting. They were not a close family unit. Far from it, but they were still together. Also, Betty claimed on page 163, Dan maneuvered Betty out of the Coral Reef house because of the crack in the foundation, and he did it purposely to take away her equity in the home. First of all, there's no way Dan could have created the house problem as they were separating. It was a coincidence, and Betty's name was still on the title of the home. She would receive a large settlement for that home after they sold it. It was not, as she said, possession is 9/10 of the law. On page 125, Stumble said Dan meantime was sending Linda flowers and jewelry while she drove his Corvette around town. Her birthday was June 26. It doesn't sound like they were no longer together, but no one really knows but them. Talking about Dan's relationship with Betty, Stumble said on page 126, why couldn't he even smile at her anymore? Every time he walked through the door, he looked 10 years older. The frown lines are so frozen. He couldn't even talk to the kids without looking distracted. His eyes, always so intense, seemed to be perpetually burning with some inner rage. He was thinking of Linda. It appeared to be more than just lust and giving in to temptation. The desire to be with another person may have been a red flag indicating Dan no longer loved Betty. Dan found someone in Linda who would listen to him and respected him, not put him down and nag him all the time, like Betty did. He had fallen in love with her, and he felt trapped in a marriage with Betty. Betty was growing more desperate to keep her marriage together. On page 127, Stumbo said she volunteered to have her body surgically restored, if possible, to its original childbearing condition. Maybe they should have more children after all. The Band-Aid baby. Sometimes couples who have children and are having problems in their marriage and don't want to break up think having another child together will bring them closer. Relationship experts say it won't work. The problems in the marriage will not be solved, and the baby will add additional stress to the relationship. Plus, it has to be said that Betty really didn't want any more children. She only offered to get pregnant again to hold on to Dan. She bought another $10,000 Bob Mackie dress for the 1984 Blackstone Ball. She hired a photographer to take their picture together, but the photo Betty chose for her book only showed her. She said the photographer was afraid of Dan, but that's not what was going on. The photographer probably could tell he was dealing with two people who were miserable together. He just wanted to get his job done and get out of there. On page 156, Betty said, there we are in all our glory, the unhappiest couple in the world. And we made it. We had everything, and we had nothing. But at least we were well dressed for it, like a funeral. For Betty to say that, knowing what she would do to Dan, is incredibly creepy. This woman has no self-awareness at all. None. On page 128, Stumble said that November she threw herself into the grandest party she'd ever planned, a 5-day celebration of Dan's 40th birthday. Schwartz Noble, on page 80, said his birthday was on Thursday, Thanksgiving Day. It was a week-long celebration for 40 people, and Betty arranged it all. Gone were the days when Dan bent over backwards for Betty. Now Betty had to accommodate Dan and do whatever he wanted to make him happy, and she hated it. The photo from that time says it all. There's almost something menacing on her face. She looks like a bomb getting ready to explode. Schwartz Noble on page 80 also said Betty sold her stocks to pay for it. Probably not. Betty was a member of the Coast Charter Investment Club, a group of La Jolla women who purchased stock in businesses like Euro Disney. The membership dues were $30 a month. It gave them something to play around with. On page 112, Stumble said That autumn, Dan's parents visited them in La Jolla. His mother wanted to see her son in action, so she and Betty went to court one day. Remarkably, it was the first time Betty had ever watched her husband argue a case. Dan always said it was tacky when families were there, and I agreed, she says. Betty didn't have an interest in Dan's work life. She was only concerned with the money. Linda was there that day with Dan, too. Betty pointed her out to her mother-in-law and said Linda was trouble. Her mother-in-law assured her that Dan loved her and the children. Betty wasn't so sure. On page 128, Stumbo said, that very month, December, in fact, they made a losing $750,000 bid on another ocean view home on the island of Coronado. By now, Betty had given up her demand that they remain in La Jolla. Whatever Dan wanted was fine. They could always move back to La Jolla later, after he recovered from his midlife crisis. Betty was never going to give in to Dan. She was simply waiting until she could regain control of the marriage again. She was never going to give him up. She was also never going to let him win. Stumble continued with a quote from Betty. I thought we had weathered the storm. I thought we could go on, with our scars, but we could go on. But we would go on, until I got this S-wordy Christmas present. Schwartz Noble, on page 82, said Betty told Dan that year for Christmas she wanted a ring from the collection, a fancy jewelry store in La Jolla. It was a gorgeous emerald ring. She showed him a picture of it in a San Diego magazine. On page 129, Stumble said, what she expected that Christmas in recompense for her patience was a lavish expression of apology, something on the order of a new Porsche her girlfriend had gotten from her own philandering husband the year before. She wanted it as a sign of recommitment and to impress all the other women who had seen him out with Linda and had a large jewelry collection themselves. She wanted an expensive symbol to say he was there to stay, and this sealed it. Betty Broderick said, my life had been the worst S word, and so I wanted this humongous ring, a Savorite. I didn't need a ring. I had a ring. I wanted the ring. And the ring I wanted was in the thousands. I can't remember how many. 10,000, 30,000, which would be probably 30,000 would be like 100,000 in today's money. But it was a major ring. I was looking for my reward, but instead, he had the nerve to give me this little piece of S word in the low hundreds. Betty threw the ring at Dan, and the joy of Christmas was over. Betty later gave the ring to Kim. The ring probably wasn't as cheap as she claimed, but it wasn't the expensive piece of jewelry she wanted either. The ring Betty wanted probably cost as much as a luxury car. Betty followed the same pattern of behavior. She would blow up, then she would retreat, waiting to see what Dan would do. And finally, Dan made his decision. Stumble said on page 129, either way, it was the best Christmas present Betty Broderick could have possibly given Linda Kolkena. 2 months later, on the night of February 28th, Dan came home and told her, I'm leaving. And with that, Betty lost all control. Part 2 will be uploaded shortly.